I saved every dime for 5 grueling years to study culinary arts in France. The night before my flight, my own parents stole my passport. My mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "You are not going to Europe. Who is going to cook and clean for your sister's wedding?" I missed my flight. I played the broken, obedient daughter for 7 agonizing days. Then I walked into a federal agency to get a replacement passport. What the customs officer told me in that windowless security room did not just give me my freedom back. It exposed a 20-year lie and guaranteed my parents would never see the outside of a prison cell again. My name is Abigail. I am 28 years old. For the last 5 years, my entire existence was defined by the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a downtown Chicago diner, the permanent smell of industrial degreaser baked into my skin, and the constant throbbing ache in my lower back. I worked double shifts 6 days a week. I prepped vegetables in the freezing walk-in cooler at dawn, and I waited tables until well past midnight. I tolerated rude customers, split shifts, and cruel managers. I did it because I had a goal that kept me breathing. Every single dollar I made, every crumpled $5 bill left on a sticky table, went straight into a heavy metal lockbox shoved deep under my mattress. I had painstakingly saved $32,000. It was my tuition for a prestigious culinary program in Lyon, France. It was my ticket out of the suffocating, unloving grip of my family. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The house was dead quiet, filled only with the faint hum of the central heating. My flight was scheduled for 6 a.m. My bags, 2 battered suitcases I had bought at a local thrift store, were sitting completely packed by the front door. The taxi was coming in exactly 3 hours. I could already taste the stale airport coffee. I could already feel the incredible lightness of true freedom. I knelt beside my bed, reached into the dusty shadows, and pulled out my lockbox. I spun the metal dials, punching in my combination. The heavy latch clicked open. I reached inside to grab my passport, my birth certificate, and the thick stack of emergency euros I had exchanged the week before. My hand hit the cold, bare metal bottom of the box. I froze. My lungs simply stopped working. I blinked repeatedly, rubbing my eyes, convinced the shadows in my small room were playing tricks on me. I pulled the box directly under the harsh glow of my bedside lamp. It was completely empty. The money was gone. The documents were gone. The blue booklet that held my entire future was gone. Panic hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was a visceral, violent terror that made my hands shake uncontrollably. I tore my room apart. I ripped the sheets off the mattress, throwing pillows across the floor. I emptied my dresser drawers, dumping folded clothes into chaotic piles. I frantically unzipped my suitcases by the door, digging through carefully packed sweaters and shoes, praying I had absent-mindedly packed the documents. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I ran out into the dark hallway, my socks slipping on the hardwood floor. I pounded my fists against my parents' bedroom door. "Mom, Dad, wake up! Please, we have a massive emergency." I pushed the heavy oak door open, ready to scream that we had been robbed. But the large bed was completely empty. The duvet was perfectly smoothed over. There was no sign they had even gone to sleep. Then I heard a sound coming from downstairs. It was a soft, rhythmic clinking, like a metal spoon stirring a ceramic mug. I rushed down the staircase, my heart pounding so hard against my ribs, I thought they might crack. I turned the corner into the kitchen, fully expecting to find a broken window or a shattered back door. I burst into the kitchen and stopped dead in my tracks. The scene before me made absolutely no sense. My mother, Susan, was sitting comfortably at the oak dining table. She was wearing her pristine white floral robe, her hair perfectly pinned back without a strand out of place. She was casually sipping a cup of chamomile tea, her posture relaxed and regal. On the stove behind her, the large front burner was turned up to its maximum setting. A massive stainless steel pot of water was rolling in a violent bubbling boil, releasing thick clouds of steam toward the ceiling. My father, Robert, stood leaning against the doorframe leading to the living room. His thick arms were crossed tightly over his chest. He looked bored. Neither of them looked surprised to see me hyperventilating in the doorway at 2 a.m. "Mom!" I gasped, gripping the edge of the granite counter just to keep myself upright. "We have been robbed. Someone broke into my room while I was sleeping. My lockbox is completely empty. My passport is gone. All my money is gone. My taxi is coming in less than 3 hours. We need to call the police right now. Susan took another slow, agonizingly deliberate sip of her tea. She set the mug down on its matching saucer with a delicate clink. She did not look alarmed. She looked annoyed. "No one broke into this house, Abigail," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm, utterly devoid of any normal human empathy. She reached into the deep silk pocket of her floral robe. Her hand emerged, and she held up a familiar dark blue booklet. The gold foil emblem of the United States glinted mockingly under the harsh overhead kitchen lights. It was my passport. I exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of relief. I took a step forward, reaching out my trembling hand. "Oh my God, Mom, why do you have that? Please give it to me. I need to put it in my carry-on. I have to leave soon." Susan did not hand it to me. Instead, she stood up slowly from the table. She walked past me toward the stove, stopping right in front of the boiling pot of water. She turned to face me, looking me dead in the eye. Her expression hardened into absolute terrifying ice. "You are not going to France," she stated flatly. I froze. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy, pressing down on my shoulders. "What are you talking about? Mom, please stop playing games. My flight leaves in 4 hours. I paid for the tuition. This is my dream. You know how hard I worked for this." Susan held my passport directly over the boiling water. The steam curled around her wrist. "Your sister Stephanie is getting married in exactly 3 months, she said, her tone dripping with entitlement and disdain. "We have 200 wealthy, important guests coming from Bradley's family. Who is going to cater the rehearsal dinner for free? Who is going to scrub this house from top to bottom before the in-laws arrive? Who is going to manage the deliveries and serve the food? You owe us your life, Abigail. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. You are not leaving us high and dry to go frolic in Europe like some selfish child." Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of her words, before I could beg or plead or negotiate, she simply opened her fingers. The heavy blue booklet dropped. It hit the violently boiling water with a soft, sickening splash. "No!" I screamed. The sound tore from my throat, raw and desperate. I lunged toward the stove, fully prepared to plunge my bare hand into the scalding, bubbling water to save my future. Robert moved much faster than I did. My father grabbed me by the shoulders with crushing force. He shoved me backward with a violent thrust. I stumbled backward, my hip slamming hard into the edge of the kitchen island. Pain shot down my leg, but I hardly felt it. Robert stepped directly in front of the stove, planting his feet wide, creating a solid, immovable physical wall between me and my ruined passport. "Calm down and behave yourself," Robert barked. His face twisted with aggressive authority. "Your mother gave you a direct order. You are staying right here." I fell to my knees on the cold linoleum floor. I peered around my father's legs, watching in absolute paralyzed horror as the boiling water warped the dark blue cover of my passport. The pages fanned out rapidly. The heavy paper soaked through the ink, bleeding and running into a muddy mess. The document disintegrated in the rolling bubbles right before my eyes. 5 years of smelling like stale fry grease. 5 years of aching feet and blistered hands. 5 years of smiling at cruel customers, saving every single penny, denying myself new clothes, denying myself a social life, denying myself everything just for a chance at a real future. All of it was dissolving into a meaningless pulp in a pot of water on my parents' stove. Susan calmly reached over and turned off the burner. She picked up a dish towel and wiped a drop of water from her immaculate sleeve. "Go upstairs and unpack your bags, Abigail," she commanded, using the exact same tone she used to tell me to take out the garbage. "You have a double shift at the diner tomorrow, and Stephanie needs you to pick up her dry cleaning afterward. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." Outside, breaking the suffocating silence of the house, the sharp, bright honk of a taxi horn cut through the suburban street. My ride to the airport had arrived. The driver honked again, a cheerful sound waiting to take me to a flight I would never ever board. I could hear the taxi driver outside putting his car in park. I knew he would wait for 5 minutes before leaving. 5 minutes. The distance between me and the front door was exactly 30 feet. But with my father standing there, his jaw set in a hard line, Those 30 feet might as well have been a concrete wall. I thought about screaming for help. I thought about breaking a window. But who would believe me? To the outside world, Susan and Robert were upstanding members of the community. They were the proud parents of a bride-to-be. I was just the quiet, exhausted waitress who lived in their spare room. If the police came, Susan would simply say I was having a mental breakdown over pre-flight anxiety. She would twist the narrative effortlessly, just like she always did. The taxi honked one final time. The sound faded down the street, taking my hope with it. I listened to the heavy, deliberate footsteps of my father walking to the front hall. I heard the sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place, locking the front door. The physical trap was officially closed. I slowly pushed myself up from the cold floor. My hip throbbed where it had struck the counter. I did not look at Susan. I did not look at Robert. I turned my back on the stove and walked heavily up the stairs toward my bedroom. I was not defeated. The shock had instantly burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I was going to play the broken, obedient servant they demanded. But I was also going to find a way out no matter what it took. I did not sleep that night. When the sun finally began to bleed through the kitchen windows, I was already wearing my stained canvas apron. I stood in the exact spot where my future had boiled away just hours before. The metal pot was in the sink now. My ruined passport was sitting at the bottom of the trash can, buried under coffee grounds and eggshells. I stared at the trash can for a long time. The old Abigail would have cried. The old Abigail would have begged for an explanation. But the old Abigail drowned in that boiling water. I pulled out the heavy bags of almond flour and powdered sugar. My sister Stephanie was hosting an extravagant bridal shower luncheon that afternoon. 3 weeks earlier, my mother had volunteered me to bake 400 authentic French macarons for the event. She promised the wealthy guests that her daughter was practically a pastry chef. Of course, she never offered to pay for the ingredients. I had to cover the cost from my diner tips. At 8 in the morning, Stephanie floated into the kitchen. She wore a silk matching lounge set that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her blonde hair was perfectly tossed, and a massive diamond engagement ring weighed down her left hand. She poured herself a glass of cucumber water and leaned against the granite counter, watching me pipe the delicate pink batter onto massive baking sheets. "You need to fix your face," Abigail, Stephanie said, sighing as if my presence was a personal insult. "You look completely depressing. Bradley's mother is going to be here in 3 hours, and the last thing I need is my sister looking like a miserable servant. Put on some makeup, and make sure those are actually good. If they are dry, I am throwing them out." I kept my eyes focused on the piping bag. I did not mention that I had lost my life savings. I did not mention the flight I missed. I simply nodded. "I will make sure they are perfect, Stephanie," I said. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of emotion. Stephanie rolled her eyes and walked out of the kitchen, already typing on her phone to her bridesmaids. She had no idea that her cruelty was no longer hurting me. It was fueling me. For the next 7 days, I played the broken, obedient daughter perfectly. I became a ghost in my own life. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. When Susan barked at me to scrub the baseboards in the guest bathrooms because they were not shining to her exact standards, I got down on my hands and knees with a toothbrush and bleach. When Stephanie threw a tantrum because her wedding shoes were the wrong shade of ivory, I spent 3 hours driving across Chicago to exchange them. I let them treat me like dirt beneath their expensive shoes. They needed to believe they had completely crushed my spirit. They needed to feel secure in their absolute control. The physical labor was exhausting, but the financial abuse was the real weapon they used to keep me trapped. On Friday afternoon, I came home from a grueling 14-hour double shift at the diner. My feet were covered in blisters. My back ached with a sharp stabbing pain. I had an envelope in my pocket containing $400 in cash tips. It was the first money I had made since they stole my savings. I walked through the front door, desperate to take off my shoes. Robert was waiting for me in the hallway. He stood with his arms crossed, blocking the path to the stairs. He did not say hello. He held out his large, calloused hand. "Rent is due," he stated coldly. I looked at his outstretched hand. I lived in a tiny, unheated spare room over the garage. The roof leaked. The mattress was older than I was. Yet every single Friday, Robert demanded a massive cut of my diner tips, claiming I needed to pay my fair share for the privilege of living under his roof. It was a calculated strategy to ensure I could never save enough money to escape. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. I handed it to him without a single word of protest. Robert thumbed through the bills, his eyes narrowing as he counted the money. He pocketed the cash and gave me a curt nod. "Good girl," he grunted. "Now go clean the kitchen. Your mother is having friends over for dinner." "Yes, Dad," I replied softly. I kept my eyes lowered. I walked past him, my shoulders slumped in perfect submission. He thought he had won. He thought he had taken my money and my pride, but he was completely wrong. My submission was nothing but a performance. Internally, my mind was running like a high-speed machine. I was observing every routine. I was memorizing their schedules. I was quietly, methodically preparing for war. Over those 7 days of playing the broken servant, I moved with absolute precision. Whenever Susan left the house to go to the country club, and Robert was out at the golf course, I slipped into their master bedroom. I needed my identification documents. If I was going to get out of this house, I needed to prove who I was. I knew Susan kept a locked fireproof box in the back of her walk-in closet. I had seen her hide the key inside a hollowed-out book on her nightstand years ago. I opened the book, took the small silver key, and unlocked the heavy metal box. Inside, filed neatly between insurance policies and property deeds, I found a manila folder with my name on it. I pulled out my birth certificate and my social security card. I stared at the documents tracing the raised seal on the paper. These were the keys to my freedom. I folded them carefully and hid them in the lining of my winter coat. I locked the box, replaced the key, and left the room exactly as I found it. They suspected nothing. By the morning of the 7th day, the pieces were in place. I just needed a window of opportunity. That window arrived on a Tuesday morning. Susan and Stephanie were in a frantic rush. Stephanie had booked a highly exclusive luxury bridal fitting at a boutique downtown. It was a massive event involving champagne photographers and Bradley's wealthy mother. Susan was wearing her best pearls, shouting at Robert to pull the car around. "You are going to deep clean the carpets while we are gone," Susan ordered, pointing a manicured finger at me as she grabbed her designer purse. "And you need to prep the chicken for tonight. If the house is not spotless when I get back, you will be very sorry." "I will get it all done, Mom," I said quietly, keeping my head bowed. "Have a wonderful time at the fitting." Susan scoffed, turning on her heel. They walked out the front door, the heavy wood slamming shut behind them. I heard Robert start the engine of his luxury sedan. I stood completely still in the hallway, listening as the sound of their tires faded down the suburban street. The moment the house was silent, my posture completely changed. I threw off my stained cleaning apron and let it fall to the floor. I ran upstairs to my room, grabbed my winter coat, and pulled the hidden documents from the lining. I grabbed my purse, shoved the birth certificate and social security card inside, and walked out the back door. I did not take my car. I knew Robert kept track of the mileage. Instead, I walked 3 blocks to the nearest bus stop and rode it straight into downtown Chicago. My destination was the massive federal building that housed the regional passport agency. I had done my research during my late-night shifts at the diner. I knew that if you had proof of imminent international travel, you could apply for an emergency expedited replacement passport in person. I had a non-refundable flight receipt rebooked for later that week on my phone. I had my birth certificate. I had my social security card. I had everything the government required to issue me a new blue booklet. I walked through the heavy revolving doors of the federal building, passed through the metal detectors, and took the elevator to the passport services floor. The waiting room was packed with stressed travelers, crying children, and harsh fluorescent lights. I pulled a paper ticket from the dispenser and sat down in a hard plastic chair. My hands were sweating. My heart was racing. I kept checking the clock on the wall, calculating exactly how long Susan and Stephanie would be at the bridal boutique. I had exactly 4 hours to get this done and get back to the house before they returned. If they found me gone, the charade would be over. I looked down at the manila envelope holding my birth certificate. I thought I was simply replacing a stolen travel document. I thought I was just taking the first step to get my culinary dream back on track. I had absolutely no idea that the piece of paper in my hand was a complete lie. I had no idea that walking into this federal agency was about to trigger a catastrophic chain of events. I thought I knew the worst things my parents had done to me. I was about to find out that the horror had not even begun. The air inside the Federal Passport Agency in downtown Chicago was thick and perfectly climate-controlled, but I was shivering. I stood in the security line watching business professionals and frustrated families push their items through the X-ray machines. Every time the heavy glass revolving doors spun behind me, I flinched. I expected to see Robert charging through the lobby with his face flushed red with rage. I expected Susan to march right up to the federal guards and declare that I was having a mental breakdown. I pulled my thin winter coat tighter around my shoulders. I clutched my cheap purse to my chest. Hidden inside the zippered compartment was the manila envelope holding my original birth certificate and my social security card. Those two pieces of paper were my only proof that I actually existed. I cleared the security checkpoint and took the elevator up to the passport services floor. The doors slid open to a massive waiting room bathed in harsh, buzzing fluorescent light. The space smelled like industrial floor wax and stale coffee. Hundreds of hard plastic chairs were bolted to the linoleum floor. I walked over to the automated kiosk and pressed the button for expedited emergency travel services. The machine spat out a paper ticket with the number 412 printed in bold black ink. I looked up at the digital display boards hanging over the long row of bulletproof glass windows. They were currently serving number 380. I found an empty seat in the back corner of the room. I kept my back to the wall. I needed to see everyone who came off those elevators. My hands were sweating so badly, I had to keep wiping them on the rough fabric of my jeans. I went over the plan in my head 1,000 times. I would walk up to the window. I would show them my non-refundable flight receipt on my phone. I would hand over my documents. I would pay the exorbitant emergency processing fee with the last of my hidden cash. They would issue the new blue booklet, and I would leave. It was a simple bureaucratic transaction. I just had to hold myself together for one more hour. The digital board chimed with a sharp electronic ping. Number 412, Window 7. I stood up. My knees felt weak. I forced myself to walk normally across the vast room. I approached Window 7 and slipped my paper ticket into the metal tray beneath the thick glass. The clerk sitting on the other side was a tired-looking woman with graying hair and thick reading glasses resting on a chain around her neck. She did not look up at me immediately. She was typing rapidly on her keyboard. "How can I help you today?" she asked in a flat monotone voice. "I need an expedited emergency passport replacement," I said. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked slightly. "I have imminent international travel. My flight to France leaves in 2 days. My previous passport was accidentally destroyed." The clerk sighed heavily and extended her hand toward the metal tray. "I need your proof of travel, your completed application form, your passport photos, and your primary identification documents. I need the original birth certificate and your social security card." I unzipped my purse. My fingers brushed against the rough paper of the manila envelope. I pulled out the documents, the pristine birth certificate with the raised state seal and the blue and white social security card. I slid the entire stack through the slot under the glass along with my application and the photos I had taken at a pharmacy down the street. The clerk took the stack. She glanced at my photos and then looked up at my face to verify the likeness. She nodded once and turned her attention to the birth certificate. She flattened the document on her desk and began typing my information into her terminal. I watched her fingers move across the keys. I took a deep breath. It was almost over. I was going to get out. Then the clerk stopped typing. She leaned forward, pushing her reading glasses further up her nose. She squinted at her computer monitor. She looked down at my birth certificate again. She picked up a small handheld barcode scanner and ran it over the back of the document. The scanner emitted a low, dull beep instead of a sharp, high-pitched chime. The clerk frowned. A deep crease formed between her eyebrows. She typed another string of commands into her keyboard. She hit the enter key. The screen flashed. Even through the thick, bulletproof glass, I could see the reflection of a bright red warning banner pop up on her monitor. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Is there a problem?" I asked. My voice was barely a whisper. The clerk did not answer me. She did not even look at me. She reached out and picked up a red telephone receiver sitting next to her monitor. She pushed a single button. I watched her lips move as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones. She kept her eyes glued to her screen. The cold sweat returned dripping down the back of my neck. "Excuse me," I said louder this time. "Is something wrong with my application?" "Just one moment, ma'am," the clerk said sharply. She hung up the red phone. She gathered my birth certificate, my social security card, and my application into a tight stack and placed them face down on her desk. She folded her hands over them. Less than a minute later, a heavy door behind the counter opened. A man in a crisp white shirt and a dark tie stepped into the cubicle. He had a severe, unsmiling face. He was clearly a supervisor. The clerk leaned over and whispered something into his ear. She pointed at the computer screen. The supervisor leaned down and read whatever was glowing in that bright red box. His posture stiffened immediately. He looked through the bulletproof glass directly at me. His eyes were completely unreadable. The supervisor picked up my documents. He did not hand them back to the clerk. He held them tightly against his chest. "Ma'am, we need to run a secondary verification on your file," the supervisor said through the intercom system. The audio was slightly distorted, but the absolute authority in his voice was clear. "Please take a seat in the waiting area. We will call you when we are ready to proceed." "But my flight..." I started to protest. "I have the receipt right here. I need to pay the fee." "Take a seat in the waiting area," he repeated. It was not a request. It was a command. He turned around and walked through the heavy door, taking my birth certificate and my identity with him. The clerk immediately pressed a button on her console. The digital board chimed again. "Number 413, window 7. She looked right through me like I was no longer there. I stumbled backward away from the glass. My legs felt like lead. I walked back to my plastic chair in the corner of the room and sat down hard. The digital clock on the far wall read 11:14 in the morning. Susan and Stephanie had been at the bridal boutique for 2 hours. They would be heading back to the house soon. The paranoia hit me in a massive, suffocating wave. I gripped the edges of the plastic chair until my knuckles turned bright white. What was happening behind those locked doors? Why did the machine reject my birth certificate? I had seen Susan keep that document in her locked fireproof box for my entire life. It was the document I used to enroll in high school. It was the document I used to get my job at the diner. It had never been flagged before. My mind immediately spiraled to the darkest possible conclusion. Susan must have known I would try to leave. Susan must have discovered that the key to her lockbox had been moved. She must have gone into my room, realized I was gone, and called the authorities. She probably told the police I stole money from Robert. She probably filed a false report claiming I was a danger to myself and others. She was a master at twisting the truth to make herself look like the victim. She had isolated me from the world for my entire life. If she told the police I was a runaway thief with a history of mental instability, they would believe her without question. 30 minutes passed. The minute hand on the wall clock ticked forward with agonizing slowness. 11:44. The waiting room began to feel incredibly small. The air felt thin. Every time a door opened, my chest tightened. Every time the elevator chimed, I braced myself for the sight of Chicago police officers walking out with handcuffs. I could perfectly picture Susan standing in the kitchen sipping her tea, smiling her cold, triumphant smile while the police dragged me back to her house. She would lock me in that unheated room above the garage. She would take my wages for the rest of my life. I would never see France. I would never escape. I thought about standing up and running. I could just walk out the revolving doors and disappear into the city. But I had no money. I had no passport. And the supervisor had my birth certificate and social security card. If I ran, I would be a ghost. I would be completely undocumented. I forced myself to stay seated. I forced myself to breathe. At 11:46, the heavy wooden security door to the left of the service windows clicked open. I expected the supervisor to walk out and call my ticket number. Instead, 2 men stepped into the waiting room. They were not wearing the standard blue polo shirts of the agency clerks. They were both wearing sharply tailored dark suits. They were physically imposing, broad-shouldered, and athletic. As they scanned the room, I noticed the coiled, clear wire of an earpiece curling down the side of the taller man's neck. I noticed the distinct square bulge under his tailored jacket. They were armed. They were federal agents. The waiting room went completely silent. The angry families and stressed business travelers stopped complaining. Everyone watched as the two agents walked with absolute focused purpose. They did not look at the digital display board. They did not stop at the service windows. They walked directly across the linoleum floor. They were walking straight toward my corner. My heart stopped beating. The blood drained completely from my face. I pressed my back against the wall, trapped in the hard plastic chair. The taller agent stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He looked down at my face, his expression completely blank. He did not ask for my ticket number. "Abigail," he said. His voice was deep and commanding. I could barely force my vocal cords to work. "Yes," I whispered. "Please stand up and come with us," the agent said. "Am I under arrest?" I asked. My voice shook violently. "Did my mother call you? Did Susan file a report? I promise I did not steal anything. The money was mine. I earned it." The second agent stepped slightly to the side, blocking my view of the exit. "Please stand up, ma'am. We need to speak with you in a secure area. Right now." I stood up. My legs were shaking so badly I almost collapsed. I gathered my empty purse. The taller agent gestured toward the heavy wooden security door. I walked forward, flanked on both sides by armed federal officers. The entire waiting room watched me as I was escorted away. I felt completely humiliated. Susan had won. She had beaten me again. We walked through the security door. The sounds of the waiting room were instantly cut off, replaced by the heavy, dead silence of a secure government corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low electric hum. We walked down a long hallway lined with closed, unmarked doors. There were no windows. There was no natural light. The taller agent stopped in front of a door at the very end of the corridor. He swiped a keycard. The heavy lock disengaged with a loud mechanical clack. He pushed the door open and gestured for me to step inside. I walked into a small, windowless room. The walls were painted a sterile, institutional gray. In the center of the room was a heavy metal table bolted directly to the floor. 2 steel chairs faced each other. In the far corner, a security camera blinked with a steady red light. Sitting in the chair on the far side of the table was a third man. He was older with silver hair and a deeply lined face. He wore his suit jacket unbuttoned. Resting on the metal table perfectly centered in front of him was a thick, dense manila file folder. "Please take a seat," the senior agent said, pointing to the empty chair across from him. The 2 escort agents stepped outside and pulled the heavy door shut. The lock engaged behind me. I was completely trapped. I pulled out the metal chair and sat down. I wrapped my arms around my stomach, trying to hold myself together. The senior agent did not speak immediately. He opened the thick file folder. Resting right on top of the stack of papers was my birth certificate and my social security card. The agent looked down at the documents. He studied the raised state seal. He studied the printed name. Then he slowly lifted his head and looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was piercing, analytical, and entirely unexpected. He did not look at me like a criminal. He looked at me like a ghost. He placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward. The air in the windowless room grew impossibly still. The moment had arrived, and the words he was about to say would shatter my entire reality. The senior agent kept his hands flat on the metal table. He looked at me with a steady, clinical gaze. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who was about to dismantle a bomb. He reached for the birth certificate I had handed the clerk just an hour ago. He slid it across the cold steel surface until it rested right in front of me. I stared at the raised seal, the typed letters of my name, Abigail Miller. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice completely level. "The document you handed my clerk this morning is a highly sophisticated forgery." I blinked. The words did not make sense. I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of my chair. "No, that is impossible," I stammered. "My mother gave that to me. She kept it in a fireproof lockbox my entire life. It is the exact same certificate I used to get my job at the diner. It is the exact same one I used to register for high school." The agent did not blink. "Local school districts and small businesses do not have access to federal verification databases," he replied calmly. "They look at the watermarks. They look at the seal. The people who manufactured this document paid a lot of money to make it look authentic to the naked eye, but it lacks the embedded microprinting required by federal law." When my clerk scanned the serial code on the back, it did not register in the state database. It registered as a blank void. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. I swallowed hard. Okay, I said, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe my parents lost the original. Maybe they panicked and bought a fake one because they did not know how to navigate the system. They are not criminals. They are just strict. The agent let out a very slow, measured breath. He opened the thick manila folder sitting in front of him. He pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in digital readout lines and a scanned image of my ink prints. When you apply for an expedited emergency passport, the agent continued, his voice dropping an octave, we run your fingerprints through the National Registry to ensure you are not fleeing a warrant. We ran yours 20 minutes ago. He leaned forward, the metal chair creaking under his weight. It flagged a direct hit, he said. But the hit did not come back to Abigail Miller. The silence in the room became absolutely deafening. I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. I looked from the fingerprint scan to the agent's face. I do not understand, I whispered. Who did it come back to? The agent looked me dead in the eye. The pity in his gaze was almost too much to bear. You are not Abigail Miller, he stated firmly. Your real name is Abigail Sterling. You were reported missing from the federal system exactly 20 years ago. The room seemed to violently tilt on its axis. My vision blurred. I grabbed the edges of the table to keep myself from falling out of the chair. Abigail Sterling. The name echoed in my head like a distant bell ringing in a heavy fog. It sounded foreign, yet somehow deep in the absolute core of my memory, it struck a resonant chord. Missing, I gasped, struggling to pull air into my lungs. What do you mean, missing? I have lived in the same house in the suburbs for my entire life. Susan and Robert raised me. Stephanie is my sister. The agent pulled another photograph from his file. He slid it across the table and placed it directly over the forged birth certificate. It was a picture of a young couple standing in front of a beautiful brick estate. The man had my exact eye shape. The woman had my exact smile. They were holding a little girl with curly brown hair. Those are your biological parents, the agent said quietly. Jonathan and Catherine Sterling. They died in a private plane crash 20 years ago when you were 8 years old. You were not on the flight. I stared at the photograph. A sharp, violent pain erupted behind my eyes as deeply buried memories tried to tear their way to the surface. I remembered a large brick house. I remembered the smell of expensive perfume. I remembered a man tossing me into the air and catching me. I had always thought those were just childhood dreams. Whenever I mentioned them to Susan, she would slap my arm and tell me I had an overactive imagination, warning me to stop making up lies. Susan and Robert are not your parents, the agent continued, his voice slicing through my rising panic. They are not blood relatives to you in any capacity. They do not even have a legal adoption on file. I looked up at him, my mind desperately trying to assemble the shattered pieces of my reality. Then who are they? I demanded, my voice finally finding a shred of strength. If they are not my parents, why do I live with them? Why did they take me? The agent turned the page in his file. He pulled out a bank statement. It was heavily redacted, but I could clearly see massive rows of numbers. Money, the agent said simply. A staggering amount of money. He tapped his index finger against the bank statement. Your biological parents were incredibly wealthy. Jonathan Sterling was a venture capitalist. Catherine came from generational real estate money. When they died, their entire estate was placed into the Sterling Trust, an irrevocable fund established entirely for your benefit. The trust is currently valued at $14 million. I stopped breathing. $14 million. I had spent the last 5 years of my life scrubbing congealed grease off a diner grill. I had walked miles in the snow because Robert refused to let me use the car. I had saved crumpled single-dollar bills in a metal lockbox just to afford a culinary program. I was a millionaire. I was a multimillionaire. Susan and Robert did not adopt you, the agent explained, his tone laced with professional disgust. Before your parents died, Susan and Robert were employed by the Sterling estate. Robert was their groundskeeper. Susan was their house manager. The words hit me like physical blows. House manager, groundskeeper. The people who had forced me to scrub their floors, cater their parties, and serve them. Like royalty were literally hired help. They had completely inverted reality. They had turned the heiress into the maid. When your parents passed away, the agent went on the trust stipulated that whoever assumed legal guardianship of you would receive a monthly caretaker stipend to ensure you were raised in the lifestyle your parents intended. Susan and Robert forged adoption papers using their insider access to your family's records. They moved you out of your childhood home, changed your last name to Miller, and vanished into the suburbs. But why, I begged, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and hitting the metal table. Why go through all that trouble? Why not just raise me normally? Because of the stipulations of the trust, he answered. The caretaker stipend they receive is $15,000 a month. That is $180,000 a year tax-free deposited directly into their accounts just for keeping you alive. $15,000 a month. The sheer magnitude of the theft paralyzed me. I thought about the marked-down grocery store birthday cakes. I thought about the winter I had to wear 2 pairs of socks because Robert said boots were too expensive. I thought about Stephanie parading around in designer clothes while I wore her discarded stained hand-me-downs. They were using my money to fund the golden child. They were using my inheritance to live like suburban royalty, all while telling me I was a financial burden. There are 2 specific conditions attached to that $15,000 monthly payout, the agent said, his eyes narrowing. The stipend automatically ceases the moment you permanently leave their primary residence, and it permanently dissolves on your 30th birthday, at which point the entire $14 million principal transfers directly to your exclusive control. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying speed. This was why they never let me go to normal schools. Susan had insisted on homeschooling me until high school, isolating me from teachers and counselors who might have asked questions about my background or noticed the complete lack of physical resemblance to my supposed family. This was why Robert forced me to give him my diner paychecks under the guise of charging me rent. If I had no money, I could never move out. If I never moved out, they kept getting the $15,000 every single month. And then the ultimate realization hit me. The passport. I looked at the agent, my eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. The culinary program in France, I whispered. My flight was today. The agent nodded slowly. We know. We pulled the flight manifest when your fingerprints flagged the system. Susan boiled my passport, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound clarity. She came into the kitchen at 2 a.m. and dropped it into a pot of boiling water. She told me I could not leave because she needed me to cater Stephanie's wedding. I thought she was just being her usual cruel, controlling self. I thought she just wanted to ruin my life out of spite. It had nothing to do with the wedding, the agent said flatly. It was entirely about self-preservation. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. If you boarded that flight to France, you would be leaving their primary residence. The $15,000 monthly payments would stop immediately. The trust administrators would be notified of your change of address. But more importantly, a long-term student visa requires a deep background check by international immigration authorities. The French consulate would have run your documents through the federal database. The forged birth certificate would have been flagged instantly. The entire 20-year fraud would have been exposed the second you landed in Europe. I sat completely paralyzed in the metal chair. Susan and Robert had not just stolen my college fund. They had stolen my entire identity. They had kidnapped a grieving 8-year-old girl, stripped her of her name, and turned her into an indentured servant just to milk a massive trust fund. They had watched me suffer, watched me exhaust myself at a diner, watched me cry over a ruined passport, all to protect their criminal enterprise. Stephanie knew. The realization washed over me like ice water. Stephanie was 2 years older than me. She was 10 when I came to live with them. She had to have known I was not her real sister. She had spent the last 2 decades treating me like garbage, knowing full well she was living in luxury funded entirely by my dead parents. The designer shoes I drove across the city to exchange. The 400 macarons I was forced to bake. It was all paid for with my blood. Are you going to arrest them? I asked. My voice was no longer shaking. The fear had completely evaporated. The sadness was gone. In their place was a cold, absolute calculating fury. That is the plan, the agent said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. We have enough evidence of document forgery and federal identity fraud to secure arrest warrants today. The FBI will coordinate with local Chicago police to raid the house this afternoon." "No," I said instantly. The agent stopped writing and looked up at me, clearly surprised by my sudden shift in tone. "Ma'am, these people have committed massive federal felonies. They are keeping you in a state of financial captivity." "I know exactly what they are doing," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "And if you arrest them today, they will deny everything. They will claim they were protecting me. They will say the forged documents were a desperate mistake by loving parents trying to keep a troubled girl safe. Stephanie will play the weeping, traumatized daughter. They will hire the best defense lawyers in the city using the money they siphoned from my trust. They will drag this out in court for years." I leaned across the metal table, placing my hands perfectly flat on the surface, mirroring the agent's posture. "I do not just want them arrested," I told him, looking directly into his eyes. "I want them completely destroyed. I want them to lose everything they stole. Stephanie is getting married in 3 months to a wealthy high society groom. They are planning to use my money to fund a massive lavish lifestyle display. I want to know exactly how much they have stolen, where they hid it, and how to get it back." The agent studied me for a long, silent moment. He saw the shift. He saw the servant girl disappear and the heiress take her place. He reached under the table and pulled out a sleek encrypted laptop. He opened it and pushed it toward me. "If you want to dismantle them completely," he said quietly, "you are going to need a very specific kind of help. We have already contacted the attorney who manages the Sterling Trust. He has been looking for you for 20 years. The screen illuminated, showing a secure video conference waiting room. "It is time for you to meet Thomas Sterling," the agent said. "He is your late father's brother. He is your real uncle, and he is going to help you burn their entire world to the ground." The encrypted laptop screen flickered for a brief second before resolving into a crystal-clear image. Sitting in a heavily paneled high-rise office was a man in his late 60s. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and a muted blue tie. His silver hair was neatly combed, but his face was completely drained of color. He leaned closer to his web camera. His breath caught audibly in the microphone. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and pressed a trembling hand over his mouth. For a long, silent moment, he simply stared at me through the digital connection. "You have Catherine's eyes," he whispered. His voice was thick with decades of unresolved grief and sudden overwhelming shock. "You have my brother's exact jawline." He swallowed hard, trying to regain his professional composure, but the tears forming in his eyes betrayed him. "My name is Thomas Sterling," he said. "I am an estate attorney in New York. I am your late father's older brother. I am your real uncle, Abigail. I have spent the last 20 years of my life and millions of dollars trying to find you." I sat frozen in the cold metal chair of the windowless federal security room. The federal agent who had escorted me stood quietly by the door, letting the reality of the moment settle over me. I looked at the man on the screen. For the first time in my entire existence, I was looking at someone who shared my blood. I saw the familiar shape of my own nose and the exact slope of my own forehead mirrored in his older, weathered face. A profound, agonizing ache blossomed in my chest. All those years I spent scrubbing floors and wondering why I was so uniquely unlovable suddenly evaporated. I was loved. I had always been loved. I had just been stolen. "They took you," Thomas continued, his voice dropping into a dark, furious register. "When the plane crashed, your parents had not yet finalized their permanent guardianship contingencies. Susan and Robert were the estate managers. They lived on the property. They had temporary physical custody of you while the court sorted out the tragedy. Instead of handing you over to the family, they exploited a massive jurisdictional loophole. They forged adoption decrees using their insider access to the estate records. They moved out of state in the middle of the night. They changed your last name to Miller. By the time I forced the courts to intervene, the trail was completely cold. They homeschooled you to keep you out of the federal education registry. They made you a ghost." I closed my eyes as the horrifying truth washed over me. Every single memory I had of my childhood was a meticulously constructed prison designed to keep me hidden from the man on the screen. They did it for the monthly stipend. I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside my head. The federal agent told me they get $15,000 a month just for keeping me in their house. Thomas let out a harsh, bitter laugh that contained absolutely no humor. The $15,000 a month was just the baseline, Abigail. It was just the operational cost of their crime. The true depth of their theft goes far beyond that. He reached outside the frame of the camera and pulled a massive bound ledger onto his desk. He opened it and stared at the pages with absolute disgust. The Sterling Trust is currently valued at $14 million, Thomas explained. The central principle was designed to grow until it reached full maturity. It matures in exactly 3 months. On the day you turn 29, the entire trust dissolves, and every single asset transfers directly to your exclusive personal control. 3 months, I repeated. My mind raced back to Susan standing in the kitchen, dropping my passport into the boiling water. She did not just want me to cater a wedding. She was desperate to keep me trapped under her roof until the very last possible second, to squeeze every drop of wealth she could before the legal deadline severed her access forever. They have been draining the trust for years, Thomas said, leaning closer to the camera. The original trust document included mandatory emergency provisions. If you ever suffered a catastrophic medical crisis or required extreme educational intervention, the trust administrators were legally bound to release emergency funds to your guardians to ensure your survival. Susan and Robert discovered this clause 10 years ago. Thomas flipped a page in his ledger. They have submitted dozens of fraudulent medical claims. They provided the trust administrators with forged invoices from private foreign clinics claiming you suffered from rare degenerative autoimmune diseases. They claimed you required expensive experimental therapies just to stay alive. The trust paid out every single invoice to protect you. Over the last decade, they have illegally siphoned over $3 million in emergency funds. My stomach churned with violent nausea. $3 million. I thought about all the nights I walked home in the freezing rain because Robert refused to buy me a bus pass. I thought about the torn shoes I wore to my double shifts at the diner. I thought about the $32,000 I had literally bled to save for culinary school. Where did the money go? I demanded. They live in a normal suburban house. They do not own yachts or private jets. Robert drives a nice car, but nothing that screams millions of dollars. Thomas looked at me with a profound, deeply sorrowful expression. They funneled every single stolen dollar into your sister, Stephanie. The name hit me like a physical strike to the jaw. They laundered the medical disbursements through shell companies and used them to build a completely fabricated elite lifestyle for their biological daughter, Thomas explained. The luxury vehicles Stephanie drives are leased under corporate entities funded by your trust. Her designer clothes, her private overseas vacations, her exclusive country club memberships, all of it was bought and paid for with money meant to keep you alive. They forced you to live like a penniless servant so they could turn their golden child into suburban royalty. The absolute pure evil of their strategy clicked into place. Stephanie knew. She had to know. Every time she demanded I bake her pastries, every time she complained that I looked depressing, she was fully aware she was wearing clothes bought with my dead parents' money. She was a willing, active participant in my enslavement. And now there is the wedding, Thomas said, his tone sharpening into a razor edge. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his desk. 2 weeks ago, Susan submitted an emergency medical requisition for $200,000. She claimed you required an immediate life-saving surgical intervention. The trust approved it. The money was wired to an account controlled by Robert. We tracked the outflows this morning. That entire sum was immediately redirected to luxury event planners, high-end florists, and elite caterers in downtown Chicago. They are using your emergency medical funds to pay for Stephanie's wedding, the federal agent added, speaking up from the corner of the room. Thomas nodded grimly. Stephanie is marrying a man named Bradley Hughes. The Hughes family is incredibly powerful. They are old-money conservative banking magnates. They sit on multiple philanthropic boards across the city. They demand absolute social perfection and pristine legal backgrounds from anyone entering their circle. Susan and Robert knew they could not afford the kind of extravagant high society wedding required to impress the Hughes family on their actual income. So they stole your money to buy their daughter a permanent place in the elite class. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They were going to use my money to secure Stephanie a wealthy husband and then cast me aside the moment the trust matured and the funds ran dry. They had designed a perfect, flawless exit strategy at my expense. Thomas slammed his hand down on the mahogany desk. The sound echoed sharply through the computer speakers. "I am ending this today!" Thomas declared, his face flushed with righteous anger. He pointed a finger at the camera. "I have the federal agents right there with you. I have the wire fraud evidence. I have the forged medical claims. I am drafting the emergency injunctions right now. I want the FBI at that house in 1 hour. I want Susan and Robert dragged out onto their pristine suburban lawn in handcuffs. I want them locked in a federal holding cell before the sun sets." The federal agent in the room nodded in agreement. He reached for his radio, ready to call in the tactical teams. "No," I said. The word left my mouth with a calm, absolute certainty that surprised even me. The federal agent stopped. Thomas froze on the screen. "Abigail," Thomas said, his voice laced with confusion. "They have tortured you for 2 decades. They stole your identity. They stole your parents. We have the authority to end their freedom right now. You do not have to spend another single second in their presence." I leaned forward in my metal chair. The tears were completely gone. The frightened, exhausted diner waitress had vanished. In her place was the heiress they had tried so desperately to bury. "If you arrest them right now, we lose," I told my uncle, looking directly into the camera lens. Thomas frowned. "Explain that to me." "If the FBI kicks down their door this afternoon, Robert will immediately invoke his right to an attorney," I explained, laying out the tactical reality with cold precision. They have been preparing for this possibility for 15 years. They have millions of dollars of my money stashed in accounts we have not located yet. They will use my money to hire the most aggressive defense lawyers in the state. They will delay the trials. They will hide the remaining assets. I took a slow breath, letting the strategy form perfectly in my mind. "And then there is Stephanie," I continued. "If her parents are arrested today, Stephanie will play the ultimate victim. She will cry to Bradley Hughes and his conservative parents. She will claim she had absolutely no idea her parents were criminals. She will say she thought her family was just independently wealthy. The Hughes family values their reputation above all else. They might be horrified by the scandal, but Bradley will rush to protect his innocent, traumatized fiancé. They will quietly move up the wedding date. They will absorb her into their high society fortress. Stephanie will get exactly what she wants. She will escape with a rich husband and a perfect life, while I spend the next 10 years fighting her parents in federal court." Thomas leaned back in his leather chair. He stared at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep swelling pride. "You are absolutely brilliant," he whispered. "You think exactly like your father." I turned to the federal agent in the room. "I do not just want them arrested," I told him. "I want them completely destroyed. I want them to lose every single thing they value. I want the Hughes family to see exactly who they are marrying. I want Stephanie publicly humiliated and stripped of every stolen luxury she thinks she owns." "What do you propose?" Thomas asked, a dangerous smile finally breaking through his grief. "I need hard, irrefutable evidence of the offshore accounts and the direct wire transfers," I said. "We need the exact routing numbers they used to hide the rest of the $3 million. If we have that data, you can freeze their entire financial network permanently before they even know they are under investigation." The federal agent crossed his arms. "Robert is not going to just hand over his bank records, ma'am. He is a sophisticated fraudster. He keeps his digital footprint heavily secured. I know exactly where he keeps it," I replied. "Robert has a locked home office on the ground floor of the house. He spends hours in there every single night managing his investments. He thinks he is a mastermind, but he is arrogant. He hides the spare physical key to his office door taped under the bottom shelf of the hallway coat closet. I have seen him use it 100 times when he thought I was busy scrubbing the floors." I looked back at Thomas. "I need to go back to the house. I need to get inside that office and copy his entire hard drive." "Absolutely not," Thomas said instantly, his voice rising in panic. "Abigail, it is too dangerous. These people are desperate. They just burned your passport to keep you captive. If they catch you breaking into that office, they will realize you know the truth. They could hurt you. I just found you. I am not sending you back into a house with kidnappers. I am the only one who can get past their defenses. I argued, my voice hardening into an undeniable command. If you send agents with a warrant, Robert will initiate a hard drive wipe before you even get through the front door. He has a panic protocol set up on his desktop. I heard him bragging about it to Stephanie. The data has to be extracted silently from the inside. The federal agent rubbed his jaw, looking back and forth between the screen and me. She is tactically correct, Mr. Sterling. If the target has a wipe protocol, a kinetic raid is highly risky. We need the raw data to follow the money matrix. Thomas ran a shaking hand through his silver hair. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. How can you go back there, Abigail? How can you look them in the face, knowing what they did to you? I have played the broken, obedient servant for my entire life, I said softly. I can play the role for a few more days. They think they broke my spirit this morning when they destroyed my flight to France. They expect me to be quiet and submissive. They will not suspect a thing because their arrogance makes them blind. I turned back to the agent. Can you give me the technology to copy the files quickly? The agent nodded. He walked over to a heavy metal locker in the corner of the room. He unlocked it and pulled out a small, sleek black flash drive. This is a customized extraction drive, the agent explained, walking back to the table and placing the device in front of me. It does not require any passwords to bypass civilian encryption. The moment you plug it into his computer's USB port, it will automatically deploy a shadow program. It will clone his entire hard drive, his hidden folders, his browser history, and his cached bank routing numbers in less than 3 minutes. Once the light on the side turns solid green, the extraction is complete. You pull it out and walk away. I picked up the small metal drive. It felt incredibly heavy in my hand. It was the weapon that would end my nightmare. I will need a way to communicate with you securely, I told Thomas. The agent placed a simple, outdated-looking cell phone on the table next to the flash drive. It is a secure burner phone. It only dials 2 numbers. Me and your uncle. Keep it turned off and hidden until you absolutely need it. I took the phone and slipped it into my pocket alongside the extraction drive. I gathered my purse and stood up from the metal chair. The transition was complete. I was no longer a victim. I was an operative inside enemy territory. Be careful, Abigail, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. You are the most precious thing in the world to me. We are monitoring you every single second. Get the data and get out. I will call you when I have the files I promised. I walked out of the windowless room and back into the harsh fluorescent light of the federal building corridor. I checked my watch. Susan and Stephanie would be finishing their luxury bridal fitting in exactly 1 hour. I had to get back to the suburbs. I had to put my stained canvas apron back on. I had to go prep the chicken for the monsters who stole my life. I walked out into the cold Chicago afternoon, ready to burn their empire to the ground. The bus ride back to the suburbs felt like an eternity. Every red light was a ticking time bomb. I stared out the rain-streaked window, gripping my cheap purse, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had exactly 12 minutes before Susan and Stephanie were due back from the luxury bridal boutique. If Susan walked into that kitchen and found my stained canvas apron lying empty on the floor, the illusion of my broken submission would shatter. They would know I had left the house. They would know I was no longer their captive. I practically sprinted the last 3 blocks from the bus stop. The cold Chicago wind burned my lungs. I slipped through the back gate, my hands trembling as I unlocked the kitchen door. The house was completely silent. They were not home yet. I let out a jagged breath, snatched my apron off the linoleum floor, and threw it over my head. I turned on the sink, splashed freezing water on my flushed face, and pulled the raw chicken breast from the refrigerator. Less than 2 minutes later, I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening. Susan's sharp, commanding voice echoed down the hallway, complaining about the incompetence of the boutique staff. Stephanie followed, whining about how her feet hurt from standing in designer heels. I stood at the kitchen counter, rhythmically chopping vegetables, forcing my hands to remain perfectly steady. I was no longer Abigail Miller, the beaten-down diner waitress. I was Abigail Sterling, an operative inside enemy territory, slicing carrots for the monsters who had kidnapped my life. Susan marched into the kitchen and dropped her $3,000 leather handbag onto the granite island. She inspected the clean floors, her eyes narrowing as she looked for a reason to punish me. Finding none, she glared at my back. "Dinner better be ready at exactly 6, Susan barked. "Bradley is coming over, and I will not have you embarrassing us with dry chicken. And fix your hair. You look like a street vagrant." "Yes, Mom," I replied. My voice was a flawless imitation of a defeated child. I kept my eyes focused on the cutting board. Serving dinner that night was an exercise in pure psychological torture. I carried heavy porcelain platters of roasted chicken and asparagus into the formal dining room. I poured chilled white wine into crystal glasses. I watched Robert, the man who had stolen my identity to secure a massive monthly paycheck, laugh loudly and clap his future son-in-law on the shoulder. Bradley Hughes sat next to Stephanie, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire elegant lifestyle he was marrying into was funded by the stolen blood money of the quiet girl serving him potatoes. Stephanie took a sip of her wine and sneered at me. "Abigail, this chicken is incredibly bland," she complained loudly. "I swear you are entirely useless outside of a commercial kitchen. If you mess up the food at my rehearsal dinner, I will make you pay for a real caterer." I stood in the corner of the dining room holding an empty serving tray. I looked at Stephanie. I knew the truth now. She was fully aware that I was not her sister. She knew she was wearing a diamond necklace bought with my dead parents' money. The rage inside me was a towering inferno, but I kept my face utterly blank. I bowed my head slightly. "I am sorry, Stephanie," I said softly. "I will do better." Robert watched me from the head of the table. His eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply suspicious. My submission was too perfect. I could feel his gaze tracking my every movement as I cleared the plates. When the dinner was finally over and Bradley had driven away in his sports car, I stood at the kitchen sink scrubbing the heavy pots. The house was quiet again. Then I heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps of my father, or rather the man pretending to be my father, walking up behind me. "I need you in my office," Robert stated. It was not a request. I dried my hands on my apron and followed him down the hallway. Robert's home office was a fortress. The door was solid oak and he kept it locked at all times. He sat down behind his massive mahogany desk and pulled a single sheet of paper from a leather folder. He pushed it across the polished wood toward me. He uncapped a heavy gold pen and placed it next to the document. "Sign this," Robert commanded. I looked down at the paper. The header read Tax Dependency Waiver and Financial Consent Form. The dense legal jargon blurred together, but the signature line at the bottom had my fake name printed clearly. "Abigail Miller." "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice small and timid. Robert leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Stephanie's wedding is becoming incredibly expensive," he explained smoothly. "Bradley's family expects a certain level of sophistication. Because you live under our roof and eat our food, you are legally our dependent. This waiver simply allows me to claim your diner income against our household tax liabilities. It will free up some capital so your mother can pay the florists. You owe us this much, Abigail. We let you stay here. Sign it." My heart pounded against my ribs. I knew Robert was a sophisticated fraudster. I knew this piece of paper was a trap. I reached for the pen, letting my hand shake violently. "I am just so tired, Dad," I whispered, letting a single tear fall down my cheek. "I worked a 14-hour shift yesterday. My vision is blurry. Can I please just read it over tonight and sign it in the morning? I promise I will sign it before I go to the diner." Robert's jaw tightened. He hated delays. He slammed his hand down on the desk. "You are incredibly ungrateful," he snarled. "Take the paper. Sign it tonight. Leave it on the kitchen counter before you go to work tomorrow. Do not test my patience, Abigail." I snatched the paper, nodded furiously, and hurried out of his office. I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the freezing, unheated room above the garage. I locked my flimsy door and sat on my sagging mattress. My hands were trembling as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the secure burner phone the federal agent had given me. I powered the device on. The screen glowed with a harsh blue light. I pressed the single programmed button to connect directly to Thomas Sterling, my real uncle and estate attorney. He answered on the first ring. Abigail Thomas said, his voice tight with worry. "Are you safe? Did you get the extraction drive inside? I am safe, I whispered into the receiver, keeping my voice barely audible. But Robert just cornered me. He demanded I sign a document. He claims it is a tax dependency waiver to help pay for Stephanie's wedding. Read me the first 3 sentences, Thomas ordered sharply. I held the paper up to the dim light of my bedside lamp and read the dense legal text. When I finished, a heavy, terrifying silence hung on the line. Abigail, do not sign that paper, Thomas said. His voice was trembling with absolute rage. That is not a tax waiver. That is a comprehensive and irrevocable power of attorney. I felt all the blood drain from my face. What does that mean? I asked. It means they know you tried to leave, Thomas explained. They know you saved money. They know you applied for a passport. They are terrified that you are going to slip out of their grasp before your 30th birthday. If you sign that document, you are legally granting Robert total administrative control over any and all financial assets associated with your identity. The Sterling Trust matures in exactly 3 months. The day you turn 29, the $14 million principal transfers to you. If Robert holds your power of attorney, he can legally drain the entire $14 million the second it hits your account. He is trying to steal the principal before you can escape. My vision tunneled. They were not just stealing my $15,000 monthly caretaker stipend anymore. They were going for the kill. They were going to take the entire $14 million and leave me with absolutely nothing. I have to get the evidence tonight, I whispered to Thomas. If I do not leave this paper signed on the counter by tomorrow morning, Robert will know I'm fighting back. He will panic. He will wipe his hard drive and transfer the offshore money before you can freeze it. We are standing by. Thomas said, his voice a steady anchor in the dark. Plug the flash drive in. Let the green light turn solid. Get out of that room. Call me the moment you are clear. I hung up the burner phone and shoved it back into my pocket. I looked at the digital clock on my cheap nightstand. It was 11:30 at night. I needed to wait until the house was in its deepest, heaviest sleep. I sat perfectly still in the freezing cold room, watching the red digital numbers change. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. At exactly 2:45, I quietly pushed myself off the mattress. I kept my socks on to muffle my footsteps. I crept down the narrow wooden stairs, avoiding the 3rd and 5th steps because I knew they creaked loudly. The house was completely dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the front windows. I moved silently down the main hallway toward the front door. I opened the coat closet. The hinges made a microscopic squeak, causing my heart to leap into my throat. I stood frozen for a full minute, listening for any sign of movement upstairs. There was nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I dropped to my knees and reached my hand under the bottom shelf of the closet. My fingers brushed against a small strip of duct tape. I peeled it back and caught the cold, heavy brass of the spare key. Robert was so utterly confident in his absolute control over me that he never thought I would dare to look for it. I walked down the hall to the solid oak door of his home office. I slid the key into the lock. I turned it with agonizing slowness, controlling the internal mechanism so it would not make a sound. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me. The office smelled of expensive cigars and leather. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk. Robert's high-end computer tower was sitting on the floor, its power button glowing with a soft, pulsing white light. The computer was in sleep mode. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the sleek black extraction drive the federal agent had given me. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I took a deep, steadying breath. I knelt under the desk, found the primary USB port on the back of the tower, and pushed the drive in. The computer fan instantly whirred to life. The massive monitor on the desk flared bright blue, illuminating the dark room. I scrambled up and stared at the screen. I fully expected a loud alarm to trigger or a password prompt to block me. Instead, a completely black command window popped up. Lines of green text began scrolling down the screen at a dizzying speed. The federal shadow program was bypassing Robert's civilian encryption effortlessly. I watched the screen in absolute horror as the directory names flashed before my eyes. The files were not hidden very well. Robert truly believed he was untouchable. I saw a folder named Medical Disbursements. The green text rapidly copied hundreds of PDF files. Fake invoices from Swiss clinics. Forged doctor signatures claiming I needed experimental bone marrow therapies. Staggering sums of money. $200,000. $400,000. All approved by the trust. All funneled directly into Robert's accounts. Then the program hit the email archives. The text scrolled through thousands of messages between Susan and Stephanie. One subject line caught my eye, pausing on the screen for a fraction of a second as it copied. The subject read, "The maid paying for the wedding." I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my stomach twisting into a tight, sick knot. I could read the preview text of Stephanie's email to Susan. It said, "Make sure Abigail picks up the dry cleaning before she scrubs the floors." I cannot believe her dead parents are paying for my $200,000 floral arrangements. She is so stupid she actually thinks she is saving for culinary school. We should have her serve the champagne at the rehearsal dinner. A single tear of pure, unadulterated rage slipped down my cheek. They did not just steal my identity. They reveled in my humiliation. They mocked my exhaustion. They laughed at my desperate, futile attempts to build a life. The extraction drive blinked rapidly. A small LED light on the side of the metal casing pulsed red, then yellow, then red again. The progress bar on the screen showed 90%, 95%. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the floor directly above me. It was the master bedroom. Robert was awake. My blood ran ice cold. I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy body shifting out of bed. I heard the floorboards groan as footsteps moved toward the bedroom door. He was coming out into the hallway. If he came downstairs and found me in his locked office, staring at his unencrypted files, he would know everything. He would destroy the computer. He would destroy me. The progress bar hit 99%. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They were heavy and deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. "Come on," I whispered to the machine. My voice completely silent, praying to a God I had not spoken to in 20 years. "Come on." The light on the side of the flash drive shifted from flashing yellow to a solid, brilliant green. The black command window vanished from the monitor. The screen went completely dark, returning to sleep mode. I dove under the desk, ripped the flash drive out of the USB port, and shoved it deep into my pocket. I crawled backward on the carpet, silently opening the office door just a crack. Through the gap, I saw the hallway light flick on. Robert was walking heavily down the stairs. He was wearing his gray sweatpants, rubbing his eyes. He stopped at the bottom of the staircase and looked directly down the hallway toward the office. I held my breath. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my back against the wall behind the door. If he turned the doorknob, it was over. Robert stood in the hallway for what felt like a lifetime. He grunted, turned around, and walked into the kitchen. A second later, I heard the refrigerator door open and the sound of liquid pouring into a glass. I did not wait. I slipped out of the office, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and carefully turned the key to lock it. I darted down the hallway, slid the spare key back under the duct tape in the coat closet, and sprinted silently up the dark stairs to my freezing room. I locked my door and collapsed onto the sagging mattress. My entire body was trembling. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and dialed the single program button. Thomas answered immediately. "Abigail, I have it." I whispered into the phone, clutching the extraction drive in my other hand, like a physical lifeline. "I have the drive." The light turned green. "I have everything." I could hear a massive shuddering sigh of relief on the other end of the line. "The federal agents are waiting for the upload," Thomas said, his voice thick with fierce determination. "Plug the drive into the port on the bottom of the burner phone. It will transmit the cloned data through our secure network." I found the small connection port and slid the drive in. The screen of the phone lit up, displaying a progress bar, as the stolen files hurtled through the digital space landing directly on the servers of the federal authorities in downtown Chicago. "It is done," I said softly. "We have the data," Thomas confirmed, his tone shifting into pure tactical aggression. "I am looking at the routing numbers right now. Abigail. They have hidden over $2 million in 3 separate offshore accounts. We are initiating the freeze protocols immediately. By the time the sun comes up, Robert and Susan will not have access to a single penny of your money. What about the wedding rehearsal dinner? I asked. I am instructing the bank to flag their credit lines, but manually authorize the catering and venue charges for the rehearsal tomorrow night, Thomas explained. We are going to let them walk right into their own extravagant trap. They are going to stand in front of the Hughes family, absolutely certain of their wealth, completely unaware that their entire financial empire has been locked down by the federal government. I looked at the forged power of attorney document sitting on my nightstand. The piece of paper Robert demanded I sign to drain the final $14 million. I will sign the document, I told Thomas. I will leave it on the counter tomorrow morning. I will wear the catering uniform. I will serve the champagne to Stephanie. I will let them believe they have completely won. Thomas paused. Are you sure you can do this, Abigail? You do not have to be the one to confront them. The agents can handle it. No, I said, my voice hardening into absolute steel. They stole 20 years of my life. They made me scrub their floors while they bought diamond necklaces with my blood. I am going to stand in the middle of that ballroom, and I am going to be the one to tear their entire world to shreds. The morning sun hit the cracked window of my freezing room above the garage, but I had not slept a single minute. My hands still felt the cold metal of the flash drive. The fake tax dependency waiver sat on my nightstand right where Robert had left it. I stared at the forged signature line. I knew that if I did not handle this morning perfectly, my entire operation would collapse before the federal agents could secure my stolen inheritance. I forced myself out of bed. I put on my stained uniform. I walked down the narrow wooden stairs to the kitchen. Susan was already awake. She stood by the marble island holding a cup of gourmet coffee. Stephanie was sitting on a high bar stool, scrolling through her phone. She wore an expensive silk robe. I walked into the room, keeping my eyes fixed directly on the floor. I walked to the commercial refrigerator to pull out the massive heavy trays of chicken I had prepped the night before. Stephanie slammed her phone face down on the granite counter. The sharp, loud sound made me jump. She glared at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Are you completely brain dead? Abigail, Stephanie demanded. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with extreme entitlement. You did not sign the tax waiver. Dad said you begged him for more time like a pathetic little child. We need that tax credit process today, so my wedding florist does not cancel the imported orchids. You are literally ruining my rehearsal dinner because you are too stupid to sign a single piece of paper. Susan took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She did not intervene. She enjoyed watching Stephanie tear me apart. It fed her massive ego to see me belittled and broken down. I turned around slowly, holding a heavy aluminum pan of raw chicken. I let my shoulders slump forward. I made my breathing shallow and erratic. I needed them to believe I was completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of their control. I am just so confused, I said. My voice trembled, perfectly mimicking deep fear. I do not understand what the paper means. I am terrified to sign something I do not understand. Please, Stephanie. I just need a few more days to read it. My head hurts so much from the diner shifts. I cannot think straight. Stephanie let out a loud, dramatic groan. She stood up from the bar stool and marched across the large kitchen. She stopped mere inches from my face. She smelled like expensive floral perfume and pure, absolute malice. Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat, Stephanie hissed, her eyes narrowed into vicious slits. You do not need to understand it. You just need to sign it. Do you have any idea how much money my wedding is costing our parents? Do you have any idea what kind of people the Hughes family are? Bradley comes from absolute generational old money. His parents demand absolute perfection. They expect my family to match their extreme wealth and high social status. You are a useless diner waitress who lives in our house for absolutely free. If you do not sign that paper before my rehearsal dinner tonight, I will personally pack your cheap clothes into garbage bags and throw you out onto the street. You will have absolutely nothing. You will be homeless, Abigail. Susan finally spoke up from the other side of the kitchen island. Her voice was smooth and terrifyingly calm. Your sister is absolutely right, Abigail. You have tested our patience for the very last time. You tried to sneak off to France and abandon your severe obligations to this family. We stopped you because we know exactly what is best for you. If you do not sign that dependency waiver by the time the rehearsal dinner starts tonight, we will lock you out of this house forever. We will not give you a single dime to survive. You will freeze and starve on the streets." I let the aluminum pan slip slightly from my grip so it clattered loudly against the granite counter. I raised my trembling hands to my face and began to hyperventilate. I forced genuine tears to pool in my eyes. I dropped to my knees on the cold kitchen floor right in front of Stephanie. I began a full-blown fake panic attack. I gasped for air, clutching my chest and shaking my shoulders. "Please do not throw me out," I cried out loudly. "Please, Mom. Please, Stephanie. I will sign it. I swear I will sign it. Just let me bring it with me to the country club tonight. I will sign it right before the speeches. Please, just do not make me homeless. I have nowhere else to go in the world. I am so sorry. I am so terribly sorry." I sobbed into my hands, letting my shoulders heave up and down. I played the broken, helpless victim flawlessly. I fed their massive narcissistic egos exactly what they craved. They deeply needed to see me crawling on the kitchen floor, begging for their mercy and validation. Stephanie looked down at me and smiled. It was a cold, dark, victorious smile. She nudged my knee with the toe of her expensive silk slipper. "That is exactly what I thought," Stephanie said smugly. "Bring the paper to the country club tonight. Sign it in the catering kitchen before you serve my future in-laws their champagne. And fix your terrible makeup, Abigail. You look completely repulsive." Susan nodded in solemn agreement. "Get back to work, Abigail. The chicken needs to be loaded into the catering van in exactly 2 hours." I stayed on the floor for another minute, letting out fake ragged sobs as they walked out of the kitchen to get dressed for their luxury spa appointments. The very moment I heard the heavy front door click shut, my tears stopped instantly. My breathing returned to a slow, calm, steady rhythm. I stood up from the hard floor. My face was completely dry. I wiped the dust off my knees. I had bought exactly the time I needed to finish them. I walked out the back door into the freezing Chicago morning air. I walked to the edge of the property behind the large wooden garbage bins where no one could see me from the street. I reached deep into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the secure burner phone the federal agent had given me. I pressed the single programmed button. Thomas answered on the second ring. His voice was sharp and intensely focused. "Abigail, are you completely secure?" "I am standing outside by the trash," I said softly. "They just left for the spa. Stephanie threatened to throw me out on the street to starve if I do not sign the forged power of attorney tonight at the rehearsal dinner." I acted like I was having a severe mental breakdown. I begged them for mercy. I promised to sign it at the country club right before the speeches begin. I bought us 10 hours. Do you have the data from the cloned hard drive? I could hear the frantic, heavy typing of multiple keyboards in the background on his end. Thomas took a deep, long breath. His voice resonated with absolute pure triumph. "We have absolutely everything," Abigail, Thomas said. "The extraction drive worked perfectly. You successfully pulled out 10 years of comprehensive financial records. We found the 3 offshore shell companies Robert set up in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. We tracked every single fraudulent medical disbursement they authorized against the Sterling Trust over the last decade. The Federal Financial Crimes Unit has been working since 3 in the morning, tearing apart their entire digital footprint." "Did you freeze the stolen money?" I asked. My heart hammered with intense anticipation. "Every single penny of it," Thomas confirmed fiercely. "We executed a silent federal asset freeze exactly an hour ago. Robert and Susan have absolutely zero access to their offshore accounts. We froze their domestic checking accounts. We froze their high-yield savings. The millions of dollars they stole from your inheritance are completely locked down by the United States government. They cannot move a single dime. They are completely financially paralyzed and entirely bankrupt. But they do not know yet," I clarified, wanting to be absolutely sure the trap was secure. "No, they do not know a thing," Thomas replied. "That is the most beautiful and terrifying part of this tactical operation. The federal agents instructed their banks to allow all small local transactions to process normally for the next 12 hours, so they do not get remotely suspicious. They can buy their coffee and pay for their spa treatments. But if they try to move anything larger than $50 out of the country, the system will flag a silent decline and alert the authorities immediately. What about the rehearsal dinner tonight? I asked. Stephanie said it is costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The exclusive country club will expect final payment this evening. Thomas let out a low, dark chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. I spoke with the federal director in charge of the task force this morning. We specifically instructed the bank to manually authorize the massive deposit to the ultra-exclusive country club for tonight. We told the major credit card companies to let the massive catering tab and the ridiculous floral tab clear without any issues. Why would we let them pay for a massive luxury party with my stolen money? I asked, feeling a sudden flash of confusion. Because we deeply need them to walk into the trap with absolute, unshakable confidence, Thomas explained methodically. The Hughes family is arriving tonight. Bradley Hughes comes from a generational wealth family that prides itself on strict legality and extreme conservative social standing. If Robert and Susan experience massive credit card declines this morning, they will panic and run. They will cancel the dinner and flee the state before the federal agents can surround the building and secure the perimeter. We need them to feel like absolute untouchable royalty tonight. We need them to stand in the center of that grand ballroom surrounded by the most powerful people in Chicago, completely certain that they have won. We want them to puff up their chests with extreme pride right before we pull the floor completely out from under them. I nodded slowly, finally understanding the sheer tactical brilliance of the plan. Let them climb as high as possible, so the inevitable fall destroys them completely. There is one more crucial thing, Abigail, Thomas said. His voice grew incredibly serious and dark. When we analyzed the final massive wire transfer they made yesterday, we discovered exactly what they bought with the $2 million they siphoned from your emergency medical fund. What did they buy? I asked, gripping the small burner phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. A massive piece of prime real estate in the richest northern suburb of the city, Thomas revealed. Susan purchased a fully furnished $2 million mansion yesterday afternoon. The deed is completely paid off in cash. She illegally registered the property under Stephanie's name. She plans to stand up in front of the entire Hughes family at the rehearsal dinner tonight and present Stephanie and Bradley with the official deed to their new marital home. She is going to use your stolen inheritance to prove to the wealthy Hughes family that she belongs in their elite, untouchable social class. The profound audacity of their crime stole the breath right out of my lungs. They were going to hand my stolen money to Stephanie on a silver platter, while I served them drinks in a cheap, scratchy catering uniform. They were going to cement their fake legacy while they actively planned to throw me out on the freezing street tomorrow morning. The federal tactical teams will be in position at the country club by 7 o'clock tonight, Thomas said. They will be dressed in civilian formal wear. I am flying into Chicago right now. I will be walking through those ballroom doors the exact moment you give the signal. You just have to endure a few more hours, Abigail. You have to play the broken waitress one last time. I will be ready, I promised. I hung up the burner phone and walked back inside the house to load the heavy catering van. The rest of the day moved in a surreal, hazy blur of intense physical labor and quiet, burning anticipation. I loaded hundreds of pounds of food, heavy floral centerpieces, and massive boxes of expensive imported champagne into the back of a rented delivery van. I drove across the city to the incredibly exclusive Oak Creek Country Club. The venue was absolutely breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. The floors were polished imported marble. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a perfectly manicured private golf course. It was a secluded playground for the incredibly rich, and I was immediately directed to enter through the dirty loading dock by the trash compactors. The arrogant country club staff handed me a cheap, stiff black uniform. It consisted of a scratchy polyester button-down shirt, tight black slacks, and a dark, heavy apron. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun. I looked exactly like the invisible, miserable help they wanted me to be. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the grand ballroom began to fill with guests. The deep contrast between my reality and theirs was absolutely sickening. I stood in the dark corner of the room, holding a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes. I watched the Hughes family arrive with an air of absolute superiority. Bradley Hughes was a tall, handsome man with a perfectly tailored tuxedo and an arrogant, confident smile. His parents walked beside him, radiating old money dominance. His mother wore a conservative, heavy diamond necklace, and inspected the ballroom with a critical, judging eye. His father stood tall, shaking hands with business associates, discussing corporate mergers and international investments. They were profoundly obsessed with their pristine public image. They demanded absolute social perfection from anyone entering their circle. Stephanie made her grand entrance 20 minutes later. She wore a custom silk gown that dragged elegantly across the marble floor. She dripped with expensive stolen jewelry. She laughed loudly, clinging to Bradley's arm, parading around the room like a reigning, untouchable queen. Susan and Robert followed closely behind her. Robert wore a custom-fitted tuxedo, perfectly playing the role of the successful, wealthy patriarch. Susan wore a heavy velvet dress beaming with smug, victorious pride. I walked through the crowded room, keeping my head down, serving champagne to wealthy people who did not even bother to look at my face. Every time I passed Stephanie, she would intentionally bump my shoulder or snap her fingers at me, demanding fresh drinks for her wealthy future in-laws. "Make sure you do not spill anything on Mrs. Hughes," Stephanie hissed at me when I handed her a glass. "You already look pathetic and miserable, Abigail. Do not ruin my perfect night. And do not forget you are signing that paper in the kitchen before the speeches start. If you try to back out, I will have the club security drag you into the parking lot by your hair." I nodded submissively. "Yes, Stephanie. I will sign it." I kept moving through the crowd, my eyes subtly scanning the perimeter of the massive ballroom. I saw them immediately. Standing near the heavy mahogany exit doors were 4 men and 2 women wearing sharp, formal evening wear. They blended in perfectly with the high society guests, but their physical posture was completely different. They stood with tactical balance. Their eyes constantly scanned the room, monitoring the exits, tracking Robert and Susan. I noticed the faint, subtle outline of earpieces hidden carefully behind their collars. The federal agents were in position. The perimeter was entirely secured. There was absolutely no way out for the monsters who stole my life. At exactly 8 o'clock, the country club manager chimed a small, elegant bell, requesting the guests to take their seats for the formal dinner service. The 200 wealthy attendees moved to their assigned tables. The Hughes family sat at the main head table, located directly in the center of the room, beneath the largest crystal chandelier. Stephanie sat next to Bradley, glowing with absolute victory. Robert sat on her left, and Susan sat on her right. Susan reached down under the table and placed a heavy, luxurious leather binder on her lap. I recognized the gold embossing on the cover from the digital documents I had seen in Robert's cloned office files. It was the physical deed to the $2 million mansion. She stroked the leather cover with her manicured fingers, her eyes shining with predatory excitement. She was preparing for her ultimate moment of social triumph. She was going to stand up in front of the most powerful people in the city and prove that her family belonged among the absolute elite. I stood near the swinging kitchen doors, my hands folded behind my back. The forged power of attorney document was folded neatly in my pocket alongside the secure burner phone. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been taken entirely. The entire false empire they had built on the bones of my stolen childhood was teetering on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. I watched Susan adjust her expensive velvet dress and smile warmly at the Hughes family. The tension in my chest morphed into pure, icy resolve. The long, painful years of playing the broken servant were officially over. It was finally time to burn their world to the ground. The ballroom of the Oak Creek Country Club was a masterpiece of manufactured elegance. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the polished marble floors. Everywhere I looked, there were towering arrangements of imported white orchids, cascading down the center of each dining table. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted tenderloin, and the unmistakable metallic tang of extreme wealth. I stood near the heavy wooden doors leading to the catering kitchen, holding a massive silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. My physical reality was a jarring, disgusting contrast to the luxury surrounding me. The country club management had forced me to wear a stiff, scratchy black polyester uniform. The collar of the button-down shirt chafed against my neck. The black slacks were tight and uncomfortable. My feet, wrapped in cheap non-slip shoes, throbbed with a dull, relentless ache from the 14-hour prep shift I had already worked at the diner that morning. I was the invisible help. I was a prop in their grand theatrical production. I watched the room with sharp, calculated focus. 200 of the most elite influential people in Chicago high society were mingling, sipping drinks, and laughing at polite jokes. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the lavish spectacle around them was completely funded by a massive federal crime. My eyes locked onto my fake parents. Robert stood near the center of the room, wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo. He held a glass of bourbon in one hand and gestured expansively with the other. He was deep in conversation with a group of wealthy conservative investors, playing the role of the self-made corporate patriarch to absolute perfection. He laughed loudly, showing off his expensive dental veneers. Susan stood just a few feet away, completely in her element. She wore a heavy dark emerald velvet evening gown that dragged slightly on the marble floor. Her neck and wrists were draped in thick diamond jewelry. I knew exactly where those diamonds came from. I had seen the forged medical invoices on Robert's computer the night before. Susan had claimed I needed emergency autoimmune treatments to authorize a $60,000 trust disbursement. She used my fictional suffering to buy those specific diamonds so she could parade around the country club looking like royalty. I gripped the edges of my silver tray until my fingers cramped. I forced my face to remain entirely blank. Then I saw her. Stephanie made her way through the crowd, clinging tightly to the arm of her wealthy fiancé, Bradley Hughes. Stephanie looked like a magazine cover model. She wore a custom silk gown that hugged her figure perfectly. Her blonde hair was swept up into an elaborate style, and a massive diamond engagement ring sparkled on her left hand. She was the absolute center of attention, basking in the admiration of Bradley's incredibly powerful family. Bradley Hughes came from generational banking money. His family demanded pristine reputations and flawless social standing. His parents, William and Patricia Hughes, walked closely behind the young couple. William Hughes was a tall, intimidating man with silver hair and a stern, judging expression. He evaluated everyone in the room as if he were calculating their net worth. Patricia Hughes was an older, severe woman wrapped in a silver shawl. She looked down her nose at the serving staff, clearly displeased by anything less than absolute perfection. I was instructed by the catering manager to circulate through the crowd and offer champagne to the head table guests. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the heavy tray, and walked directly into the lion's den. As I approached the center of the room, I could hear Stephanie's shrill, confident voice echoing over the soft background music of the string quartet. "Oh, Bradley, it is just so exhausting trying to manage the floral deliveries," she complained dramatically, leaning her head against his shoulder. My parents have been so incredibly generous paying for all of this, but it is just a massive undertaking. I am so glad we hired the absolute best vendors in the city. Bradley smiled a smooth, arrogant smile and kissed the top of her head. "You deserve the best, Stephanie. My parents were just saying how impressed they are with your family. Your father has built an incredible real estate portfolio. He is exactly the kind of man my father respects. A true self-made American success story." I stepped up to their small circle and lowered the silver tray. "Champagne, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and deferential. Bradley did not even look at my face. He simply reached out and took a glass from the tray. "Thank you," he murmured dismissively. Stephanie, however, turned her head and looked directly at me. Her bright blue eyes narrowed into vicious, calculating slits. She saw the cheap polyester uniform. She saw my hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun. She saw the deep, dark circles under my eyes from days of extreme exhaustion and absolute terror. She loved it. She fed on my humiliation like it was a vital nutrient. "Oh, Abigail," she said, her voice dripping with toxic fake sweetness. "I did not realize they had you working the floor tonight. I thought you were just going to stay in the back and scrub the dishes." Bradley's mother, Patricia Hughes, turned around and looked at me. She frowned, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. "Stephanie, dear, do you know this waitress?" she asked, her tone laced with absolute confusion and mild disgust. Stephanie laughed, a high-pitched tinkling sound that grated against my eardrums. "Oh, Mrs. Hughes, this is Abigail. She is just a girl my parents took in years ago out of the goodness of their hearts. She had a very troubled background. My parents basically saved her from the streets. We let her live in the room above our garage. She helps out with the cooking and the cleaning to earn her keep. She is incredibly lucky my family is so charitable." I stood perfectly still, holding the heavy tray of champagne. The sheer audacity of her lie was breathtaking. She was standing in a ballroom paid for with my stolen inheritance, wearing diamonds bought with my fake medical bills, while publicly branding me as a pathetic charity case. Patricia Hughes let out a soft, condescending sigh. Well, that is very noble of your parents, Stephanie. But I do hope they keep a close eye on the silver. You never know with people from those kinds of backgrounds. I will keep that in mind, Mrs. Hughes, Stephanie replied, smiling brightly. She turned back to me, her expression hardening into a cruel sneer. Make sure you do not drop that tray, Abigail. You could never in your entire miserable life afford to replace a single one of those crystal glasses. Now go get us some fresh appetizers. We are hungry. Yes, Stephanie, I said softly. I bowed my head slightly, playing the broken subordinate role flawlessly. I turned around and walked away from the group. As I moved back toward the perimeter of the ballroom, I allowed my eyes to scan the room one more time. I was not looking at the wealthy guests. I was looking for the shadows. Standing near the heavy mahogany exit doors, I spotted a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He was pretending to check his phone, but his physical stance was completely grounded and alert. I noticed the faint, subtle coil of a clear earpiece resting just behind his collar. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second and gave a microscopic confirming nod. The federal agents were firmly in position. They had secured every single exit point in the building. Then my gaze shifted toward the back of the room near the grand staircase. Standing quietly in the shadows, obscured by a massive floral arrangement, was Thomas Sterling, my real uncle, my father's brother. He wore a dark suit and held a thick leather briefcase in his right hand. He was watching Robert and Susan with an expression of cold, absolute fury. He saw me looking at him. He did not smile. He simply squared his shoulders, ready for the signal. The trap was not just set. The steel jaws were completely open, waiting for the perfect moment to snap shut. I walked back toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The noise of the ballroom faded slightly as I pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the bright, chaotic atmosphere of the prep area. Waiters were rushing past me, carrying massive trays of roasted vegetables and carved beef. The air was thick with heat and the smell of industrial dish soap. I set my empty silver tray down on a stainless steel counter. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. Abigail. The voice cracked like a whip over the noise of the busy kitchen. I turned around. Susan was standing just inside the swinging doors. She had followed me out of the ballroom. The warm, polite smile she had been flashing to the wealthy guests was completely gone. Her face was a mask of cold, ruthless authority. She marched across the wet tile floor, ignoring the busy catering staff who quickly stepped out of her way. She cornered me against the stainless steel prep sink. The harsh overhead fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across her face, making her look predatory and hollow. She reached into the small, elegant clutch purse she was holding and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. She also pulled out a heavy gold pen. I immediately recognized the document. It was the forged tax dependency waiver. The absolute and irrevocable power of attorney Robert had demanded I sign the night before. The legal weapon they needed to completely drain the $14 million Sterling trust before I turned 29. Susan stepped so close to me I could smell the heavy, expensive musk of her perfume. She shoved the folded document and the gold pen aggressively into the center of my chest, pinning me against the edge of the metal sink. I told you to leave this on the kitchen counter this morning, Abigail. Susan hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, restrained anger. You disobeyed a direct order from your father. I am sorry, Mom, I whispered, forcing my voice to tremble. I was just so rushed this morning. I had to load the catering van. I forgot to sign it. Please, I will sign it when we get back to the house tonight. Susan pressed the pen harder into my chest. You are not going back to the house tonight until this is signed, she spat. Do you think I am stupid, Abigail? Do you think I do not see what you are trying to do? You are trying to delay. You think if you push this off long enough, you can sneak out and run away to France. You think you can escape your obligations to this family. She leaned in closer, her eyes wide and manic. The time for games is absolutely over. Robert is going to stand up in that ballroom in exactly 10 minutes and give his toast. He is going to present Stephanie with the deed to a $2 million home. He is going to solidify our family legacy in front of the most powerful people in this state. I need this power of attorney signed right this second, so Robert can process the final financial transfers in the morning. I looked down at the document. The signature line glared up at me. Abigail Miller, the fake name they had forced upon me to hide my true identity. I am scared, Mom, I said, playing my final desperate card. I do not understand what I'm signing. I just want to read it first. Please. Susan let out a sharp, vicious laugh. It was a sound devoid of any maternal warmth or basic human decency. You do not need to understand it, you ungrateful little brat. Susan snarled, her voice echoing slightly in the corner of the busy kitchen. You do not have the right to question us. We took you in. We fed you. We clothed you. You were absolutely nothing before we gave you a purpose. You owe us every single breath in your lungs. She grabbed my wrist with her free hand, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. Sign it right now, she commanded, her tone dropping into a deadly whisper. Sign it right now, or I will walk out there and tell the country club manager that you are caught stealing from the guests. I will have their private security drag you out the back door and throw you out into the freezing rain. You will not be allowed back into our house. You will have no money. You will have no passport. You will have absolutely nothing. You will starve on the streets, Abigail. You are nothing without us. Sign the paper. The threat hung heavy and toxic in the humid kitchen air. For 20 years, that exact tone of voice had paralyzed me. For 20 years, that absolute threat of abandonment and homelessness had kept me locked in a cage of fear. I had shrunk myself into a tiny invisible shadow, just to survive their constant psychological warfare. But something fundamental had shifted inside me over the last 48 hours. The terrified 13-year-old girl sitting on the porch with 2 garbage bags was gone. The exhausted diner waitress crying over a ruined passport was gone. I looked down at Susan's hand gripping my wrist. I felt the sharp pressure of her nails. I looked at the forged legal document pressed against my chest. And then I looked up. I looked Susan directly in the eye. I did not drop my gaze. I did not blink. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I let the absolute cold, hard reality of my power surface. I stared at her with the unshakable confidence of an heiress who was entirely aware that she held the absolute destruction of her abusers in the palm of her hand. Susan saw the shift. Her cruel, triumphant expression faltered. A rapid flash of genuine confusion crossed her face as she realized I was no longer terrified. I slowly reached up and took the gold pen from her hand. Susan let out a small, breathless sigh of relief, thinking she had won. Good girl, she whispered. Sign the line. I held the pen in my right hand. I looked at it for a brief second. Then I simply opened my fingers. The heavy gold pen dropped. It hit the hard tile floor of the catering kitchen with a sharp, loud metallic clack. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the room. It rolled away, disappearing under the stainless steel prep counter. Susan gasped, taking a sudden step backward. Her eyes went wide with absolute shock. Abigail, what are you doing? She hissed, her voice rising in sudden panic. Pick that up. Pick that up right now. I did not move to pick it up. I reached out and took the forged power of attorney document from her trembling hand. I held the paper in both of my hands. I looked Susan dead in the eye one final time. I am not signing anything, Susan. I said, my voice completely calm, utterly steady, and radiating absolute authority. Before she could process what was happening, before she could scream or grab me or call for security, I turned my back on her. I walked away from the prep sink. I walked past the shocked catering staff. I pushed both of my hands flat against the heavy wooden swinging doors of the kitchen. I pushed the doors wide open and stepped completely out of the shadows. I walked directly onto the bright, polished marble floor of the main grand ballroom. The string quartet was still playing. The hundreds of wealthy guests were still talking. Stephanie was still laughing. Robert was still holding his glass of bourbon. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had just vanished. The trap was perfectly set. The execution had begun. The sharp clink of silver against crystal rang out across the grand ballroom. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings and instantly silenced the quiet chatter of 200 elite guests. I stood perfectly still near the edge of the dance floor. My hands were empty. My cheap polyester catering uniform felt heavy and suffocating against my skin, but I did not move a single muscle. I watched my father, or the man I had been forced to call my father for 15 years, step up to the polished wooden podium. Robert wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled a bright, rehearsed smile. He looked exactly like the wealthy, successful patriarch he had always pretended to be. He cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, family and esteemed friends," Robert began, his voice booming smoothly over the sound system. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate love, family, and the beautiful future of my daughter Stephanie and her incredible fiancé Bradley." Robert gestured grandly toward the center table. Stephanie beamed her diamonds, catching the light of the massive chandeliers. Bradley Hughes sat beside her, looking smug and satisfied. Robert turned his attention directly to the Hughes family table. "William and Patricia Hughes, we want to formally welcome you into our family. We know that the Hughes name represents generations of hard work, integrity, and absolute spotless reputation in this city. We pride ourselves on those exact same values. In our family, we believe that true success is built on a solid foundation of honesty and relentless hard work." I listened to his words and felt a cold, sharp knot tighten in my stomach. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost hypnotic. Robert paused for dramatic effect, letting the wealthy crowd hang on his every word. "For the last 20 years, my wife Susan and I have worked tirelessly to provide a life of absolute security and abundance for our children. We wanted to make sure Stephanie started her new life with Bradley on the most solid foundation possible. So tonight, Susan and I have a very special surprise." Robert reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a thick, luxurious leather binder. He held it up high for the entire ballroom to see. Inside this binder is the fully paid-off deed to a $2 million estate in the northern suburbs. It is yours, Stephanie. A perfect home for a perfect couple built on the clean, honest success of this family. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Wealthy investors and socialites clapped enthusiastically. Stephanie let out a high-pitched shriek of joy and threw her arms around Bradley. Susan sat at the head table, wiping away a single fake tear of maternal pride. William Hughes nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the massive financial display. Patricia Hughes smiled a tight, polite smile, signaling her ultimate acceptance of the Myers family into their elite circle. They had won. They had successfully bought their way into high society, using the exact money they had drained from my stolen childhood. The applause began to die down. Robert raised his hand to quiet the room, preparing to finish his toast. That was the exact moment I took my first step. I walked away from the shadows of the catering doors. I stepped directly onto the brilliantly illuminated marble dance floor. I did not walk like a beaten-down waitress. I walked with the straight spine and the absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who held the power to destroy everything in the room. My cheap rubber-soled shoes made a soft squeaking sound against the polished stone, but my pace was deliberate and heavy. A few guests near the back tables turned to look at me, their faces scrunched in confusion. A waitress was not supposed to be on the floor during a toast. Murmurs began to ripple through the back rows. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the bandstand, located just to the right of the head table. A second microphone was resting on a tall metal stand near the string quartet. I walked right past the shocked faces of the country club members. I walked past women in designer gowns who pulled their silk skirts away from my cheap uniform. The murmurs grew louder. Susan saw me first. Her fake maternal smile instantly vanished. Her face twisted into a mask of pure vicious panic. She stood up so quickly, her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor. "What is she doing?" Susan hissed, her voice carrying sharply in the sudden quiet of the room. "Security! Remove this waitress immediately. She is completely out of line. Get her out of here." I did not stop. Two private security guards started walking briskly toward me from the perimeter, but they were too late. I reached the bandstand. I grabbed the microphone from the stand and gripped it tightly in my right hand. I turned to face the entire room. I looked directly at the head table. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The silence in the massive ballroom was absolute and deafening. 200 of the most powerful people in Chicago were staring directly at me. My name is not Abigail Miller, I said. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, perfectly clear and stripped of any fear. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers and settled over the stunned crowd. I looked right into Robert's eyes. His face had suddenly lost all of its color. The confident swagger had instantly melted away, leaving behind the terrified stare of a cornered animal. I am not a waitress, and I am certainly not their charity case. My real name is Abigail Sterling. The name landed like a physical blow in the silent room. A few of the older financial executives in the crowd gasped audibly. They knew the Sterling name. They knew about the wealthy family that had died in a tragic plane crash 20 years ago. I kept my eyes locked on the head table. And the $2 million mansion you just proudly gifted your daughter was not bought with hard work or honest success. I continued, my voice rising with cold, undeniable authority. It was bought 2 days ago, using a completely fraudulent wire transfer from my stolen trust fund. The ballroom descended into immediate chaotic shock. Voices erupted in 100 different directions. Stephanie screamed. She slammed her hands on the table, her face turning blotchy and red. "You are a liar!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are a crazy, pathetic liar." Bradley, do not listen to her. She is just a jealous maid. She is having a mental breakdown. Get her out of here. Susan lunged forward, knocking over her crystal wine glass. It shattered violently against the marble floor. "She is a disturbed young woman," Susan yelled, her voice shrill and desperate. "We took her in off the streets. She is having a psychotic episode." "Someone call the police right now." "I am so glad you asked for the police, Susan," I said smoothly into the microphone. "Because they are already here." At my exact words, the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung wide open. The 4 men and 2 women who had been standing quietly in the shadows all evening stepped directly into the light. They reached into their tailored suit jackets and pulled out their badges, letting them hang clearly on silver chains over their formal wear. They were federal agents. Local Chicago police officers in full uniform marched into the room right behind them, blocking every single exit. The wealthy guests scrambled backward, pushing their chairs out of the way to clear a path. Walking straight down the center aisle, flanked by 2 federal agents, was Thomas Sterling. My uncle looked like a force of absolute vengeance. He carried a thick, heavy black dossier in his right hand. He did not look at the frightened guests. He walked directly toward the head table. Robert tried to take a step backward, but his legs gave out. He collapsed back into his chair, clutching the leather binder containing the fraudulent deed to his chest, as if it could somehow protect him. Thomas did not speak to Robert or Susan. He stopped right in front of William Hughes. William stood up, his silver hair perfectly in place, but his face etched with extreme horror and revulsion at the unfolding criminal spectacle. "Mr. Hughes," Thomas said, his voice echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. "My name is Thomas Sterling. I am the estate attorney for the Sterling Trust. The people you are about to merge your family with are currently under federal investigation for grand larceny, identity theft, and multi-million-dollar wire fraud." Thomas opened the thick black dossier and handed a stack of heavily stamped documents directly to William Hughes. "You value your pristine family reputation above all else, Mr. Hughes," Thomas continued. "I suggest you look at these verified bank records. They prove that Robert and Susan Myers kidnapped my niece, forged her adoption papers, and illegally siphoned millions of dollars from her inheritance for the past 15 years. The very dinner you are eating right now was paid for with stolen money. The house they just offered your son is a piece of criminal evidence that the federal government is seizing tonight." William Hughes took the documents. His eyes scanned the first page. He saw the official federal stamps, the undeniable bank routing numbers, and the forged medical invoices. His hands began to shake with absolute, unadulterated fury. He dropped the papers onto the dinner table as if they were physically contaminated. He turned slowly and looked at Robert. The look of pure disgust on his face was completely devastating. "This is a complete abomination," William Hughes stated, his voice low and vibrating with absolute rage. "You are criminals. You have tried to infect my family with your filthy, stolen money." He turned his back on Robert and looked directly at his son. "Bradley, get away from that woman immediately. We are leaving." Stephanie let out a horrific sobbing wail. She reached out and grabbed Bradley's tuxedo sleeve. "Bradley, please," she cried, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "You know me. I had absolutely no idea. I thought my dad was successful. You have to believe me. We are getting married." Bradley looked at Stephanie. He looked at the federal agent securing the room. He looked at the undeniable proof lying on the table. His preservation instinct completely overrode any affection he might have had for her. He physically peeled her fingers off his jacket sleeve. He took 2 large steps backward, putting a clear, visible distance between himself and the Myers family. "I cannot be associated with this. Stephanie," he said, his voice completely cold and distant. "It is over. The wedding is canceled. Do not ever contact me or my family again." Bradley turned and walked quickly toward the exit, following his furious parents out of the ballroom. Stephanie collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as her entire perfectly constructed wealthy future evaporated into thin air. But the execution was not over yet. The senior federal agent walked up to the head table. He looked down at Robert and Susan. "Robert James Myers and Susan Ellen Myers, you are both under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Please stand up and place your hands behind your backs." Susan completely lost her mind. She tried to scramble backward away from the table, but her heavy velvet dress caught on the legs of the chair. She fell hard onto her knees on the marble floor. "I did it for my family," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger wildly at me. "She owed us. We fed her. We raised her. She is a miserable, ungrateful brat. You cannot do this to me. I am a respectable woman." 2 female agents stepped forward and hauled Susan off the floor. They pulled her arms roughly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Robert did not fight back. He slowly stood up, his shoulders completely slumped, his face gray and lifeless. He held his hands out submissively. An agent clamped the cuffs onto his wrists and patted him down, checking for weapons. The agents grabbed Robert and Susan by their arms. They began to march them down the center aisle of the ballroom. The 200 elite guests stood frozen, watching the spectacle in absolute stunned silence. People pulled out their phones, recording the wealthy, successful couple being dragged out of their own lavish party in federal handcuffs. The social humiliation was absolute and permanent. Every single person in their high society circle was witnessing their total destruction. They would never be able to show their faces in public again. As they were marched past the bandstand, Susan twisted her neck to look at me. Her face was streaked with black mascara, and her eyes burned with a defeated, helpless rage. I stood tall, holding the microphone, my posture perfectly straight. I did not look away. I stared right back at her, letting her see the complete and total victory in my eyes. I was no longer the frightened teenager sitting on a porch with garbage bags. I was Abigail Sterling, and I had just taken back my entire world. The massive wooden doors of the ballroom closed behind the police escort, shutting the monsters out of my life forever. The quiet chatter slowly returned to the room as the wealthy guests processed the shocking reality of what had just occurred. Thomas walked up to the bandstand and stood beside me. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me into a warm, protective embrace. "It is over, Abigail," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion and pride. "You are completely free." I looked down at the cheap black polyester uniform I was wearing. I thought about the locked room above the garage and the boiling pot of water on the stove. I had survived it all. I set the microphone down on the stand. I turned to my uncle and smiled. "Let us go home," I said. "I have a flight to catch." The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was completely silent, except for the sharp, definitive sound of the judge finalizing the sentences. Robert and Susan stood before the wooden bench. They did not look like the arrogant suburban royalty who had strutted through the country club ballroom just 6 months prior. They looked incredibly small, frail, and utterly defeated. The federal prosecutor had been absolutely merciless. They were officially charged with grand larceny, aggravated identity theft, massive wire fraud, and severe tax evasion. The trial had been a chaotic media spectacle, but I had completely refused to attend the daily circus. I only came for the final sentencing. I sat in the very back row next to my Uncle Thomas, watching the justice system methodically crush the people who had stolen 20 years of my life. The judge did not offer an ounce of leniency. Robert James Myers and Susan Ellen Myers were sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. When the judge read the final sentence, Susan literally buckled. The woman who had ruthlessly ordered me to scrub floors while she drank imported wine let out a pathetic guttural wail. She begged the judge for mercy. She claimed she was a good mother. The judge simply stared down at her and stated that her definition of motherhood was the most grotesque distortion of human morality he had seen in his entire career. 2 federal marshals grabbed Susan by the arms and dragged her roughly out of the courtroom. Robert did not say a single word. He simply lowered his head, his face completely pale, and let the marshals lead him away through the heavy wooden doors. The $15,000 monthly checks were gone. The fake prestige was completely gone. They would spend the rest of their natural lives locked in tiny concrete cells, stripped of their names and their dignity exactly as they had tried to strip me of mine. But the absolute perfection of the federal hammer did not stop with Robert and Susan. The government had initiated a total asset forfeiture protocol. Because Robert and Susan had illegally funneled millions of dollars from my stolen trust fund directly into Stephanie's lavish lifestyle, every single thing she thought she owned was officially classified as the proceeds of a federal crime. Stephanie had always believed she was born for high society. She had spent her entire life parading around in designer clothing, driving luxury vehicles, and mocking my daily exhaustion. She genuinely believed she was fundamentally superior, but the federal agents did not care about her delicate sensibilities. 2 days after the country club disaster, the Asset Forfeiture Task Force arrived at her luxury apartment complex. They seized absolutely everything. They took the keys to her pristine Mercedes-Benz. They boxed up her entire collection of designer handbags and stolen diamond jewelry. They even seized the expensive silk dresses right out of her closet, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the basic cheap clothes she had purchased before her parents discovered my trust fund emergency clauses. The $2 million mansion Susan had bought with my stolen money was repossessed by the federal government and sold at public auction. All of the funds were directly returned to the Sterling Trust. Stephanie was completely destitute. Bradley Hughes had not just canceled their $200,000 wedding. His powerful old money family had utilized their massive legal influence to completely blacklist her from every elite social circle and high-paying corporate job in the entire city of Chicago. Nobody wanted to be associated with the spoiled daughter of convicted federal fraudsters. She had no college degree because she had dropped out, assuming she would just live permanently off her wealthy husband. She had absolutely no real-world skills to survive. A few weeks ago, I had a morning meeting downtown with Thomas to finalize some outstanding trust documents. Afterward, I walked past a greasy, brightly lit fast food franchise near the train station. I glanced casually through the large glass window and stopped dead in my tracks. Standing directly behind the register wearing a cheap, heavily stained polyester uniform and a ridiculous paper visor was Stephanie. Her pristine blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, greasy ponytail. Her face was flushed and sweating as she frantically bagged French fries and handed out greasy paper cups to impatient, angry customers. A teenage manager was standing right behind her, loudly reprimanding her for messing up a massive lunch order. Stephanie looked like she was about to completely break down and cry, but she just swallowed her immense pride, nodded submissively, and turned back to the deep fryer. The golden child. The girl who had once aggressively threatened to throw me out on the freezing street to starve was now working a grueling minimum wage shift just to keep a cheap roof over her head. I stood on the sidewalk watching her through the glass for a long time. I did not feel bad for her. I did not feel the need to walk inside and gloat. I simply felt the profound, quiet weight of absolute justice. I turned around and walked away, leaving her to exactly the life she truly and deeply deserved. The recovery of my actual identity took a few months of intense legal maneuvering, but Thomas was a brilliant attorney. We filed the petitions to formally invalidate the forged adoption decrees and the fake birth certificate. The name Abigail Miller was legally eradicated from human existence. It was aggressively scrubbed from every database, every government server, and every public record. The ghost they had meticulously created to enslave me was finally dead. I sat in Thomas's beautiful Manhattan office when the final packet arrived from the State Department. My uncle handed me a crisp, heavy manila envelope. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a brand new officially issued federal passport. I opened the stiff dark blue cover. My photograph looked back at me. I was not wearing a cheap, dirty diner uniform. I was wearing a beautiful tailored blouse, my hair falling naturally around my shoulders, my eyes bright and completely alive. And printed perfectly in bold black letters across the official document was my true name, Abigail Sterling. I ran my thumb gently over the raised letters. I had survived 20 years of psychological torture, intense isolation, and massive financial theft. I had walked straight through the fire and emerged completely whole. The $14 million Sterling Trust was now entirely in my control, along with the millions the federal government had successfully recovered from Robert and Susan's hidden offshore accounts. But the money was never the most important thing. The most important thing was that I finally belonged entirely to myself. The air inside the international terminal at Chicago O'Hare was humming with the beautiful, chaotic energy of thousands of people moving toward their futures. I stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the huge planes lining the tarmac. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the early morning sky in breathtaking shades of gold and deep purple. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the sweet, absolute reality of my permanent freedom. I was holding my new blue passport in one hand and a first-class boarding pass in the other. My flight to Lyon, France was boarding in exactly 45 minutes. For 5 years, I had worked agonizing double shifts at a greasy local diner, saving crumpled dollar bills in a metal lockbox just to afford the tuition for a prestigious culinary program in Lyon. Susan had callously burned my forged passport to keep me permanently trapped. She had tried to destroy my biggest dream because she thought my only purpose in life was to serve her. But she had profoundly underestimated the blood that ran in my veins. When I regained full control of my massive trust fund, I did not just reapply for the culinary program. I asked Thomas to arrange a private meeting with the board of directors for the Culinary Institute in France. They were facing significant financial difficulties and were desperately looking for private investors to keep their historic campus open. I did not just enroll as a normal student. I bought the entire building. I became the primary financial benefactor and majority owner of the very school I had once desperately dreamed of attending. I was going to learn from the greatest chefs in the entire world, not as a desperate runaway, but as the wealthy owner of the institution. Thomas walked up beside me in the busy terminal, holding 2 cups of expensive black coffee. He handed one to me and smiled. His eyes were crinkling at the corners, radiating the kind of pure protective love I had been utterly denied my entire life. "Are you ready for this, Abigail?" he asked gently, watching the massive jet pull up to our gate. I looked at my uncle, the wonderful man who had never stopped looking for me. The man who had bravely helped me burn my abuser's empire completely to the ground. I thought about the little girl who used to hide in the freezing room above the garage, terrified to make a sound. I thought about the heavy silver tray I had purposefully dropped in the catering kitchen. I thought about Susan and Robert sitting in their miserable concrete cells, and Stephanie scrubbing grease off a fast food counter. "I am more than ready," I said softly. "I am finally going home." The gate agent called for first-class boarding. I hugged Thomas tightly, promising to call him the very moment I landed in Paris. I handed my passport and my ticket to the attendant. She scanned the document, the machine emitting a cheerful, sharp ping that sounded like absolute sweet victory. She smiled brightly at me and handed my documents back. "Have a wonderful flight, Miss Sterling," she said. I walked down the jet bridge, the sound of my footsteps steady and completely confident. I settled into the luxurious wide leather seat of the first-class cabin. I ordered a glass of the most expensive champagne they had on board. I looked out the window as the plane began to push back from the gate. The engines roared to life, a powerful, undeniable force carrying me completely away from the darkness of my past. I took a sip of the cold, crisp champagne. I was completely free. I was profoundly wealthy, and I was completely legally and permanently detached from the monsters who had tried to steal my childhood. If you have made it to the very end of this story, I want you to remember something incredibly important. The people who try to break you, The people who try to make you feel completely worthless and exceptionally small are almost always projecting their own pathetic insecurities directly onto you. They desperately want you to believe you are nothing, so they can feel like they are everything. Do not ever let them write your story. Do not ever let them convince you that your voice does not deeply matter. Setting absolute unshakable boundaries is not an act of vicious revenge. It is an act of pure necessary survival. You have every right to stand up, walk away, and completely rebuild your life on your own terms. True justice is not just watching the people who hurt you painfully fall. True justice is building a beautiful, undeniable life that they can never, ever touch again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you felt a strong connection to what I went through, or if you have ever had to fight for your own identity and freedom, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and survival. I would also absolutely love to know where my story is reaching you today. Drop a quick comment below with your city or country and the exact time you are watching this video. It means the absolute world to me to connect with all of you. Remember to always know your true worth and never let anyone steal your light. I look back on my life now, and I understand something I could never have grasped when I was a terrified teenager hiding in a freezing room. I want to share this with you, because I know so many of you have spent decades carrying weights that were never yours to bear. For 20 years, I believed that family was defined by absolute obligation and unending sacrifice. I believed that if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, I would eventually earn their love. But I learned the hardest truth of all. Abusers rely entirely on your silence. They weaponize your sense of duty. They construct a reality where you are the problem, so they never have to face their own monstrous reflections. I know many of you watching this have people in your lives who use the excuse of blood or shared history to justify their endless exploitation. They tell you that setting boundaries is an act of betrayal. They call you selfish for finally saying no. But blood does not give anyone a free pass to destroy your mental health or steal your future. We are conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, but sometimes the most necessary thing you can do to save your own life is completely shatter that bond. Finding the truth and demanding accountability is never an act of revenge. It is simply the pursuit of justice. Revenge is about inflicting meaningless pain, but justice is about restoring balance and taking back the power that was wrongfully stolen from you. You do not have to endure a lifetime of mistreatment just because the people hurting you share your last name or claim to be your parents. You are allowed to walk away from toxicity. You are allowed to stop being the invisible servant in your own life. You are allowed to claim your space and demand the absolute respect you deserve. My perpetrators thought they could steal my identity and rewrite my entire existence just to fund their lavish lifestyle. They genuinely thought I was too broken, weak, and afraid to fight back against them. They were completely wrong, and I know the people who have constantly underestimated you are entirely wrong too. We survive this torment because we have a beautiful hidden strength deep inside us that they could never possibly comprehend. Let your wonderful voice finally be heard incredibly loud and exceptionally clear. If this story reminded you of your own strength, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below with the city and time you are watching this video. I want to know how far this story of justice has traveled. Remember, your identity belongs to you, and nobody has the right to rewrite your worth. I truly hope that you will soon find the profound inner courage to firmly claim your complete independence and ultimate personal freedom, just exactly like I successfully did today. See you in the next story.